She did not wake because of a sound. She woke because of the absence of one. Martha Whitaker lay still in the dark, eyes open, listening. The wind was there. The breathing of her children was there. But the small, steady voice of the fire, the low crackle and shift that had been the background of every night since October, was gone. She was out of bed before she was fully awake. The hearth held one coal, a single point of orange light, barely the size of her thumbnail, sitting in a bed of gray ash that had gone cold at the edges. She could feel the difference in the air already. The warmth that usually pressed against her face from 6 feet away had pulled back and left something thinner and harder in its place. The water bucket near the door had a skin of ice across the top. Inside the cabin, ice forming inside the cabin. She reached for the wood herself, chose the smallest dry piece from the stack beside the hearth, and laid it carefully across the coal, not on top of it, beside it, leaning in, the way you offer something to a person who is very tired and might refuse if you ask too directly. She cupped her hands around the coal and blew once, twice. The coal brightened, dimmed, brightened again. Elias was beside her. She had not heard him get up. He was simply there, the way he was always simply there when something needed doing in the dark, kneeling on the other side of the hearth with a piece of bark in his hand, feeding the new flame before it could decide not to become a flame. Neither of them spoke. Above, in the sleeping loft, Samuel and Eliza were still. Baby Ruth made a small sound and then was quiet. The cabin breathed around all of them, wood settling against the cold outside, the thin moan of the wind finding the northwest corner, the way it always found the northwest corner, and the fire, small and new and uncertain, began to grow. 12 minutes. That was how long it took to bring the hearth back from the edge. Martha stayed where she was until she felt the heat return to her face. She pressed her fingers against the floor beside the hearth, felt the packed earth still cold beneath her, and knew the cabin had lost hours of warmth that would not come back until morning. She went back to bed. She did not sleep. She lay in the dark and listened to the fire find itself again, listened to her children breathe, listened to Ruth's small chest rise and fall in the warmth nearest the hearth. Outside, Michigan Territory, in the winter of 1836, was doing what it did every night from November to March. It was pressing in, against the walls, through the gaps, under the door, through every place where the cabin was less than perfect, which was many places. The cabin was not a warm house that happened to be surrounded by winter. It was a place where a family fought winter back, one night at a time, for as many nights as winter decided to come. That night, the fire had almost gone out. It would not be the last time. Look at the cabin before the first snow. Look at it the way Martha looked at it in October, standing in the yard with her arms crossed and the smell of cut timber still sharp in the air. Elias had called it finished 3 days ago. He had stood in the doorway with his hands on the frame and said, "There it is." She had nodded because she knew what he meant, and she had not said what she was thinking, because what she was thinking was a list. The cabin was one room, 16 feet wide, 18 feet long, with a sleeping loft above that Samuel could reach by climbing a ladder of notched logs nailed to the east wall. The hearth took up most of the north wall, built from flat creek stone and river clay, wide enough to cook in and deep enough to heat the room when the fire was properly fed. One window on the south wall, covered with oiled paper, because glass was not something the Whitakers had and would not be something they had this winter. The door was on the east side, facing the yard, hung on leather hinges that Elias had cut himself and that Martha had already looked at twice, with the private thought that they would need replacing before spring. The floor was packed earth. She walked through the room slowly the first day. The hearth first. She tested the draw by holding a strip of cloth near the flue opening and watching how it moved. The draft was good. That mattered more than almost anything else. A hearth that did not draw properly filled a room with smoke. And smoke in a closed cabin in winter was not an inconvenience. It was a slow, daily problem that worked on lungs and eyes and tempers in ways that had no solution except more wood or a better flue. Then the walls. She ran her hand along the inside of the north wall, feeling between the logs where Elias had packed chinking of clay and grass and bits of dried moss. It held in most places. In 2 places near the floor it had cracked, the clay shrinking as it dried, leaving gaps she could feel air moving through if she pressed her palm flat against the wood. She went and found the clay bucket and filled the gaps herself that afternoon. She did not mention this to Elias. Then she stood in the middle of the room and turned slowly. This was the space. This was everything there was. The winter that was coming, the one she could feel in the quality of the October light, and the way the maples had dropped their leaves all at once 4 days ago, as if they knew something. That winter would happen in this room. Cooking would happen here. Sleeping would happen here. Sickness, if it came, would happen here. Whatever was going to be hard would be hard in this room, in this light, with these walls. Elias was outside splitting wood. She could hear the axe, the clean split of it, the sound carrying through the still air. He had been splitting since first light. He would split until dark. He believed. She knew that if he worked hard enough and long enough before the cold arrived, the cold would not be able to touch them. She loved him for that belief. She did not share it. Samuel came through the door with an armload of split wood, stacking it against the interior wall the way she had shown him. He was 12 years old, and his arms were longer than they had been in the spring. He looked at the room while he stacked, and then looked at her. He said, "Pa thinks we have enough wood already." She said, "Stack it even, every piece touching the next one." He stacked it the way she showed him. Later that day, Eliza found the gap. She was 7 years old, and she moved through the cabin the way 7-year-olds move, close to the ground, interested in corners and edges. She was sitting against the north wall near the floor when she went still. Martha watched her reach out one hand and press it flat against the logs. Eliza said, "There is cold coming through here." Martha said, "I know." Eliza said, "Like a thread." Martha said, "Yes, like a thread." Eliza held her hand against the wall. Another moment. Then she got up and went back to what she had been doing. But Martha saw her look at that spot once more before supper, and once more before bed, and she understood that Eliza had begun learning something that winter teaches everyone who pays attention, that a wall is not a solid thing. It is an argument between inside and outside is always making its case. Near the door, In the corner, where the light from the window barely reached, sat a chair. It was a small chair, with a straight back and a maple frame, the kind of chair made to sit beside a fire in the evening and hold a person through long hours. Martha's father had made it in Ohio the winter before she married. He had given it to her the morning of her wedding, wrapped in an old piece of canvas, and said only something that holds you. It was not a practical chair for a frontier cabin. It took up space. And space in a 16 by 18-foot room was not something to be spent lightly. She had put it in that corner because it was the only place it did not block something more necessary. She had not told Elias what it was. She had simply put it there. The cabin was finished. Martha looked at the oiled paper window, and the leather hinges, and the clay chinking, and the sleeping loft, and the hearth with its good draught, and the stack of wood against the wall. That was not enough, and never would be enough before the season began. She started her list. Not on paper, in the part of her mind that ran quietly underneath everything else, the way a creek runs under ice in January, still moving even when you cannot see it. She had been keeping lists this way since she was old enough to understand that the difference between a family that got through something and a family that did not was usually not luck. It was the 10 things somebody thought of in October that nobody else thought of until February. She thought of them in October. She always had. Outside, the axe kept splitting. The sound of it went through the walls and into the room, and she felt it in her chest. Steady and patient. Elias, working against what was coming the only way he knew how. The leaves were all down. The sky had that particular flat white quality that meant the first snow was thinking about arriving. The cabin had a name now. It was home. Whether it was enough was a question only winter could answer. And winter was on its way. The first thing Samuel learned about winter was that it started in September. Not the cold. The cold came later. But the work that stood between a family and the cold. That work began when the leaves were still on the trees and the air still carried enough warmth that splitting wood for 8 hours made you sweat through your shirt. By the time the first frost came down hard enough to leave white on the grass in the morning, a man either had enough wood stacked or he did not. There was no correcting it after. The cold did not wait for a man to catch up. Elias had been splitting since late August. Samuel had been beside him since the first week of September, when his father handed him the smaller axe without ceremony and showed him the mark on a log. The place where the grain ran straight and the split would go clean, and said there, hit there, and Samuel had hit there, and the log had split, and his father had moved to the next one, and that was the whole of the instruction. What Samuel learned after that, he learned from the wood itself. He learned that oak split differently from maple. That maple split differently from elm. That elm would fight you and twist and refuse and then give all at once in a way that sent the pieces flying sideways if you were not ready. He learned that a log that looked solid could be punky at the center, soft and crumbling, good for nothing but a quick burn with no heat behind it. He learned that his hands, which had seemed like adequate hands in the spring, were not adequate hands for this. By the end of the first week, they were raw across the palms. By the end of the second week, the rawness had become callous, and the callous had become something he stopped noticing. He learned that one cord of wood was not one cord of wood. It was roughly 250 pieces. Each piece was a decision about heat. A thick piece of oak burned slow and held coals through the night. A thin piece of maple caught fast and threw heat quickly, but was gone in 40 minutes. You needed both. You needed to know which to use when. A fire built wrong for the night was a fire that went low at 2 in the morning in a family that woke cold. His mother knew all of this. Samuel understood that by the 3rd week of splitting, when he watched her walk to the woodpile one afternoon and stand before it with her arms at her sides, not touching anything, just looking, she stood there for what seemed like a long time. Then she walked back to the cabin without saying anything. That evening, Samuel asked her, "Is it enough?" She was at the fire, not looking at him. She said, "Ask me in March." He thought about it that night in the loft, listening to his sister breathe beside him and the wind starting up outside. And he decided what she meant was that there was no such thing as enough before the winter began. You only knew after. He thought about that for a while. Then he did something. He climbed down from the loft before anyone was awake, found the small knife his father had given him in the spring, and went to the beam that ran across the east wall below the loft. He pressed the tip of the knife into the wood and made a small mark, a careful notch, clean and deliberate. He stood back and looked at it. He was not marking a day that had passed. He was marking a day that had not yet come. He had decided, based on what he knew about winter and what he had heard from his father and from Caleb Morse down the road and from the quality of the October sky, that the first real thaw would come in the 2nd week of March. He made a mark where he thought it was, somewhere in the future, on a beam that could not yet tell him if he was right. Then he made a second mark, below the first, for today, October, the beginning. The distance between the 2 marks was the winter. He looked at it in the gray light before the family woke and understood. In the way that 12-year-olds understand things they cannot yet put into words. That this was the thing he needed to see, the whole of it, at once, laid out on a beam where he could put his finger on it. He went back to bed. In the days that followed, the woodpile grew. Elias and Samuel worked until the light went each evening, and Martha watched the pile rise against the side of the cabin with the focused attention of a woman calculating something she could not afford to miscalculate. She never said the number out loud. The number was in the way she looked at the pile each morning before she went inside, in the way she paused at the door and turned back to look at it one more time. One afternoon, Caleb Morse came down the road from his place 3 miles north, walking easy the way he always walked, a man who had been in this country long enough that the country no longer surprised him much. He stood with Elias at the woodpile, and the 2 of them looked at it together the way men look at things they are measuring. Morse said, "Good pile," Elias said, getting there. Morse said, "You want to be at 4 cords before the first hard freeze. First year I was here I had 3.5, and I thought I was fine, and I was not fine." Elias looked at the pile. Morse said, "You lose a cord in January alone if it gets cold enough." And it gets cold enough. He walked back up the road. Elias stood at the pile a moment longer and then went back to splitting without saying anything to Martha or Samuel. He did not need to. Martha had heard it from the doorway. That night she adjusted the number in her list. Not on paper, in the place where she kept numbers that mattered. She said nothing about the adjustment to anyone, because saying it would not add a single piece of wood to the pile and would add something to the air in the cabin that she did not want there yet. The days got shorter. The splitting continued. There was one afternoon in late October when the light came through the bare trees at an angle that made the woodpile cast a long shadow across the yard. And Samuel stood at the cabin door and looked at that shadow. He was learning to read the pile the way his mother read it, not as a stack of wood, but as a measurement. How many nights were in there? How many mornings? How many 2 in the morning moments when his father would get up and feed the hearth without waking anyone? He thought about his marks on the beam, the bottom mark, which was now, and the top mark, which was March, and the space between them. He went inside and added 3 more notches below the first, one for each week that had passed. Then he looked at the distance that remained between where he was and where he had put the end of winter. It was a long way. He put the knife away and went to help his father. The woodpile was not finished when the first snow came. It was close enough that Elias said it was fine, and Samuel believed him, and Martha said nothing at all, which was how Samuel learned, slowly, over the weeks that followed, that his mother's silence about the woodpile was a different kind of answer than his father's words. The cold came down from the north the first week of November. Serious cold, the kind with weight behind it. And the pile stopped growing and started shrinking, one piece at a time, one fire at a time, one night at a time. The calendar had started. In September, Martha had made a different kind of list. Not the list about the woodpile, not the list about what the winter would ask. This was the list about what fit inside 16 feet by 18 feet, and it was the most important list she made that year because everything else depended on it being right. She started with what could not move the hearth, the door, the window, the ladder to the loft. Those were fixed. Everything else was a decision. She walked the room with a piece of chalk and marked the floor where the barrels would go. Flour against the south wall, close enough to the hearth that it would not freeze, but not so close that a spark could reach it. Salt pork in the cool corner near the door, where the temperature stayed low enough to keep the meat. Cornmeal beside the flour. Beans in the cloth sack hanging from the rafter. Off the ground, away from anything that might find it in the night. 200 pounds of flour, 140 pounds of salt pork, 60 pounds of cornmeal, 40 pounds of dried beans, dried apples in a smaller sack, hung beside the beans, a crock of lard, salt in a tin box, coffee in a cloth pouch she kept near her own sleeping place because coffee was the thing that made 4:30 in the morning survivable. And survivable was the only standard she was applying this winter. Then the tools, the iron pot, the Dutch oven, the skillet, the ladle, the wooden spoon worn thin on one side from years of use. The medicine box went on the high shelf above the hearth where the children could not reach it. 1 bottle of whiskey inside, for fever and for wounds and for 2 or 3 evenings when Elias needed it to be there. A paper of needles, thread in 3 colors, none of which matched anything they owned. A roll of linen for bandaging. 14 tallow candles, made in August. She counted them and put them in the tin box on the middle shelf and counted them again. 14 candles for a winter that ran from November through the first week of April. She did the arithmetic and did not share the result with anyone. She would use them only when she had to. The room filled slowly over the first week of October. Each thing she placed had been thought about. Each thing had earned its position by being more necessary than the thing she might have put there instead. Elias watched her arrange and rearrange without commenting. He did not ask why she moved the cornmeal 3 times before she was satisfied. He trusted that she was solving a problem he could not fully see. The children had less. Samuel had his good wool coat, now a little short in the sleeve, and his boots, resoled in September with a piece of cattle hide, 2 pairs of wool socks, a knit cap Martha had made from unraveled yarn in July. Eliza had a coat that had been Samuel's the year before, taken in and lengthened, neither too large nor too small, which was the best you could do with a handed-down coat. Baby Ruth had the most wool of any of them because she was 3 years old and her body did not yet know how to argue with the cold. When everything was placed, Martha stood in the center of the room and turned. She had been in rooms this size before. She knew what a room this size felt like in July, when the door stood open all day and there was always somewhere to go outside if the walls got close. She also knew, from 2 winters in the first cabin, what it felt like in February, when the door stayed shut for days at a time, when the smell of the fire and the food and the people and the animals just outside all worked together into something that lived in the walls and the clothing and the hair. She knew what was coming. She turned until she was facing the northeast corner, where the light from the window barely reached even at midday. The chair was there, maple wood, straight-backed, with a slightly worn seat from years of use. Her father had made it the winter before her wedding, working by lamplight in his workshop in Ohio with the patience of a man who built things to last. He had given it to her on the morning she left his house, and she had carried it in the back of the wagon for 3 years and 2 moves and 1 very bad river crossing where they had lost 2 other pieces of furniture to the current. The chair had made it. It was not practical. It was not a working chair. It sat in the corner and took up space that could have been used for a second water barrel or an extra cord of wood stored inside. She had put it in the only place it did not cost her anything essential, the dead corner by the door where the light did not reach and the floor stayed coldest and nothing else wanted to be. Elias had looked at it once when she placed it and had not said anything, and she had not offered anything, and it had simply become part of the room, the way things become part of a room when nobody challenges them. The room was ready, or it was as ready as a room could be before the thing it was ready for arrived and began telling it what it had gotten wrong. Martha put her chalk away. She stood at the hearth and felt the heat of it on her face, the good solid heat of a fire properly built and a flue properly drawing. Outside, the light was going flat and gray, the sky pressing down the way Michigan Territory sky pressed down in October, a flat white ceiling that meant the first snow was close now, a few days at most. She thought about the flour barrel. She thought about the candles. She thought about the leather hinges on the door. Then she thought about her father in his workshop in Ohio, working by lamplight, making something that would hold a person for a long time. She turned away from the chair and started supper. There was still a great deal to do before the cold arrived, and the cold was not going to wait. Eliza saw it first. She was awake before the others, the way she sometimes woke before the others. Not because of any sound, but because the light coming through the oiled paper window was wrong. Not wrong in a bad way. Wrong in the way a thing is wrong when it is different from every morning before it. She climbed down the ladder without waking Samuel, and went to the window and put her face close to the paper and looked through it at the yard. White, everything white. The yard, the fence rails, the top of the woodpile, the bare branches of the oak tree at the edge of the clearing, all of it covered in a thin, perfect layer that the night had laid down without any sound at all. The sky was pale and close. The snow was still coming, small and slow, each flake taking its time. She went to the door and lifted the bar and opened it. The cold came in like a hand, not a cruel hand, a firm one. She stood in the doorway in her wool socks with the cold floor under her feet and looked out at the world the snow had made. It was the most beautiful thing she had seen since they came to Michigan territory. Samuel came down behind her, drawn by the cold air or the light or the sense that something was happening. He stood beside her and looked out. He said finally. He ran back for his boots and his coat and was out the door and into the yard before Elias or Martha were fully awake. His footprints, the first marks in all that white, breaking the surface with a sound like a quiet word said in an empty room. Eliza watched him from the doorway. Baby Ruth appeared at her elbow, having come from beside Martha without anyone noticing. She looked out at the yard with the careful expression of a 3-year-old encountering something her mind did not yet have a category for. She reached one hand out past the door frame and let a flake land on her palm and looked at it until it disappeared. Then she looked up at Eliza. Eliza said snow. Ruth said the word back, snow, as if she was keeping it. Elias came to the door and stood behind the girls and looked out. He said nothing for a moment. He looked at the yard, and then he looked at the roof of the cabin, the way the snow had settled on it. And then he looked at the woodpile, and the way the top layer of split wood had a white covering that would need to be knocked off before it soaked in. Then he looked at the sky. Martha appeared at his shoulder and looked out over his arm. She did not look at the yard. She did not look at the snow on the branches, or at Samuel making long strides through the white and laughing at nothing. She looked at the path that ran from the cabin door to the water source, 40 yards through the trees. And she looked at the way the path had already disappeared under a surface that looked the same as everything else, unmarked, as if the path had never existed. She said, I will need Samuel to keep the path clear. Elias said, I know. She said, every morning before anything else. He said, I will tell him. She went back inside to start the fire. The snow was beautiful for most of that first day. Eliza thought so. Samuel thought so. Even Elias, who was not a man who used the word beautiful, stood at the edge of the yard in the early afternoon and looked at the way the light came through the bare trees and threw long blue shadows across the white ground. And the expression on his face was something close to it. By late afternoon, the beauty had begun its second meaning. The path to the water had filled in twice. Samuel had cleared it twice, and it had filled again while he was at the woodpile, knocking snow off the split pieces so they would not soak. The trail that ran north toward Caleb Morse's place was gone. Not just covered, gone. in the sense that you could not see where it had been unless you already knew. And knowing where something was did not mean being able to walk it safely in low light with snow still coming down. The woodpile was a problem. The top layer was wet. Wet wood smoked and sputtered and gave less heat than dry wood, and made the inside of the cabin thick with smoke that had nowhere to go. Elias spent an hour moving the top layer under the small overhang of the eave, where it would have a chance to dry, and stacking the dry pieces from the inside of the pile in the order they would be used. This was not optional work. This was the difference between a fire that worked and a fire that did not, between a night that was survivable and a night that was not. Martha watched him from the window and understood all of this without being told. Inside, she was already adjusting. The door was stiffer. The cold had found something in the leather hinges, something it could grip, and the door that had swung freely all through October now required a shoulder to move it. She made a note of this in the place where she kept notes that mattered. The floor near the door was colder. She moved the flour barrel 6 inches toward the hearth because she did not want a freeze-thaw cycle working on the packed bottom of the barrel through the winter. That evening, while the children ate and the fire burned well on dry oak, Elias came inside and stood at the hearth with his hands out toward the heat. He said, not to anyone in particular, "Morse was right about the 4th chord." Martha said, "I know." He looked at her. She said, "I have been thinking about it since he came by." He said, "We are at 3.5." She said, "I know." He said, "I can cut more if the ground does not freeze too deep too fast." She said, "I know you can." She put the supper on the table. They ate. Outside, the snow continued to come down, unhurried, with the patience of something that had all winter to make its point. Eliza sat at supper and said almost nothing. She was thinking about the path to the water, the way it kept filling in. She was thinking about the shadows the trees had thrown across the snow in the afternoon. She was thinking about the sound the snow made when Samuel's boots broke through it. That soft, collapsing sound, quiet and final. She was thinking that the snow was still beautiful. She was also thinking that beautiful and safe were not the same word, and that she had not understood that until today. Before she went up to the loft, she went to the south window and looked through the oiled paper at the dark yard. The clouds had broken and there was moonlight, and the yard was lit a blue-white that made it look like something from somewhere else entirely. Something that had nothing to do with yards and paths and woodpiles and the 4 cords of split oak that a man 3 miles up the road had said were the minimum. It was still beautiful. It was the last night. It would be only that. Here is something the paintings never showed. In every picture of a frontier cabin that anyone ever made, the family is awake. They are gathered at the hearth, or the mother is cooking, or the father is reading from the Bible, or the children are playing on the floor. The cabin in these pictures is warm and complete, a circle of light in the dark, everything held together by the fire. Nobody painted what happened at night. The 2 in the morning, the 4 in the morning, the hour before dawn when the fire had burned down and the cold had crept back in, and the question of the next 12 hours was being settled in ways that had nothing to do with pictures. This is what it looked like. Baby Ruth slept nearest the hearth. This was physics, not sentiment. She was 3 years old and 31 pounds, and her body did not generate enough heat to compensate for losses the way an older body could. She slept on a small pallet that Martha had built up, with 2 layers of blanket underneath, and one on top, and a piece of oiled canvas between the layers to block the cold that came up from the floor. She slept on her side with both hands tucked under her chin, the same position every night. Reliable as a compass, Martha and Elias slept against the south wall, on a low rope bed covered with a straw tick and the heaviest quilt they owned, a double wedding ring that Martha's mother had made, and that had traveled in the bottom of a trunk through every move they had made. They slept close together, not only because they chose to, but because the south wall was the coldest wall, and 2 people shared heat in a way one person could not. Elias slept on the outside, closer to the door, not because they discussed it, because it made sense, and they both understood that without saying it. Samuel and Eliza slept in the loft. The loft was warmer than the main room because heat rose and collected there. Its disadvantage was smoke. On nights when the fire burned fast or the draft was not quite right, the smoke that should have gone up and out went up and stayed, collecting in the loft the way water collects in a low place. Samuel had learned to sleep with his blanket pulled up over his nose when the smoke was bad. Eliza had learned which direction to face, so that the small gap in the loft boards gave her a thin line of cleaner air from below. These were not things anyone had taught them. The night had a schedule. Elias fed the hearth last, just before sleep, loading it with the biggest pieces of dry oak, the ones that burned slow and held coals long. A properly loaded hearth at 10 o'clock could hold enough heat to keep the cabin survivable until 2 in the morning. The word warm belonged to July. In November, the standard was different. At some point between 2 and 3, the fire came down enough that the cold registered. This was a different cold, a cold with intention, that had been waiting outside the walls all night for exactly this moment, when the fire was low enough to let it in. It came through the floor first, then the walls, then the air itself seemed to change quality, to become thinner and harder. Martha woke first. She woke before the cold was at the point of urgency, which meant she had developed, through 2 winters, a sense of timing that was not entirely conscious. Her body knew when the fire needed attention before her mind did. She lay still for a moment, listening to the hearth. The fire was low, speaking in the quiet language of coals rather than the louder language of flame. But it was there. She got up. She moved to the hearth in the dark without a candle, because candles cost something, and she knew the room. She knew where the floor was uneven near the flour barrel. She knew the distance from the bed to the hearth in her feet. She added 2 pieces of wood, medium-sized maple for quick heat, and 1 piece of oak behind them for the long burn. And she knelt close and cupped her hands near the coals and blew until the maple caught. Then she stood and looked at the room. Ruth, still and small on her pallet, both hands under her chin. The loft above, where she could hear Samuel's breathing, slow and even. Eliza turned in her sleep and pulled her blanket tighter, not waking, registering the cold in whatever way sleeping children register things without surfacing from sleep. Elias had not moved. His breathing was the slow breathing of a man genuinely asleep, which meant the cabin was still within the range of what their bodies could manage. She took this as information. She filed it. She went back to bed. She did not sleep for a while. She lay in the dark and listened to the fire take hold again. The maple burning bright and fast. The oak waiting its turn. She listened to the wind at the northwest corner of the cabin, the place where it always found the cabin first, where the logs met at an angle that gave the wind something to press against, a patient sound, which was in some ways worse than a violent one. She listened to Ruth breathe. She thought about the flour barrel and what it held and how many mornings it needed to hold for. She thought about the path to the water and whether Samuel would keep it clear without being reminded. She thought about the leather hinges on the door. She thought about her father's chair in the corner by the door. Then she stopped thinking and just listened. The fire, the wind, the breathing of 4 people in one room, each at a different depth of sleep. Ruth's breath, light and quick. Samuel's, slower. Elias, the slowest of all, deep under sleep. The way a man gets deep under sleep when he has spent the day doing physical work in cold air. Eliza, somewhere in between. Not quite settled. This was the thing nobody put in the paintings. This listening. This taking of inventory in the dark. Not of barrels and candles and cords of wood, but of the people themselves. Their breathing, their warmth, their presence in the room. Martha did it every night. She did not think of it as something remarkable. She thought of it as the last task of the day, the one that came after everything else was done and the fire was fed and the door was barred. The task of confirming that everyone was still there and still warm and still breathing. Most nights she was back asleep within 20 minutes of getting up. On the nights she was not, she lay in the dark and did arithmetic. The flour, the pork, the candles, the wood, the distance between what they had and what they needed, and the number of days that separated now from the other side of it. She never did this arithmetic out loud. The fire burned. The cabin held its temperature. The wind worked at the northwest corner and found nothing new to work with. Sometime before 4, Martha slept. An hour later, Elias was up, moving to the hearth, with the ease of a man who did not need light to navigate his own floor, adding the morning wood, putting the water on, beginning the sequence of tasks that opened every day the same way. Fire first, then water, then everything else in the order it needed to happen. Outside, Michigan territory was dark and cold and absolutely indifferent to any of this. Inside, the hearth caught, and the water began to heat, and the family began, to surface from sleep into another day. This was how it worked. Every night, for as many nights as the winter decided to last. The cabin was not one temperature. This was the first thing a person understood when they stopped moving through it and started living in it. When they slowed down enough to feel what the room was actually doing rather than what it looked like from the center. From the center, standing near the hearth with a fire going well. A person could believe the cabin was warm. Step 4 feet toward the north wall, and that belief began to revise itself. Step to the corner by the door and it gave up entirely. Elias had chinked the walls in October, working his way around the exterior with a wooden paddle and a bucket of clay mixed with dried grass and finely shredded bark. He had done it carefully. He had filled every gap he could find, pressed the clay in deep, smoothed the surface, let it dry. He had spent 2 full days on it, and he had done good work. The winter did not care about good work. The freeze came in the 2nd week of November. The real freeze. Not the provisional cold of October, but the kind that drove down through the ground and stayed. What the freeze did to the clay chinking was what it did to everything that was wet and then became cold. It found the water still in the clay, the water that had not quite finished drying in the weeks since October. And it turned that water to ice. And ice expanded, and expansion cracked. Not dramatically, not in a way that left visible holes, in the way that 100 small failures are worse than one large one, because 100 small failures are everywhere at once, and there is no single place to fix. Elias found the first new gap on a Tuesday morning when the temperature had dropped hard overnight, and he ran his hand along the inside of the north wall and felt a thread of moving air against his palm. He pressed his fingers in and found the clay had pulled away from the log on the upper edge, a crack perhaps a 1/4 inch wide and 8 inches long. He could see light through it. Pale, cold, outdoor light, coming through the wall of his cabin. He chinked it with fresh clay. He found 3 more that afternoon. He chinked those too. The clay he used was cold now, mixed from the store he had kept in the root cellar. And cold clay was harder to work and did not pack as smoothly, and he knew, as he pressed it in with his thumb, that it would not hold as well as the October clay had held. But holding imperfectly was better than not holding at all. Martha had been watching the walls since the 1st week of November. She watched them the way she watched everything in the cabin, with the continuous low attention of someone running a system that required regular monitoring. Every morning, when the light came through the oiled paper window, she moved through the room slowly, feeling the air near the walls with her hands, standing still in corners, watching the candle flame when she carried it close to a seam to see if it moved in a draft. She found things Elias had not found. The gap near the floor on the east wall, where the bottom log met the foundation stones, too low for a man working upright to easily see. She stuffed it with a strip of cloth cut from a worn shirt, pressing it in with a stick until it filled the space. The seam above the door frame, where the wood had dried and pulled away from the notching by a thin line, she hung a piece of burlap over the door on a wooden peg, a curtain that served no decorative purpose but blocked the cold that came down from that seam and landed on whoever stood nearest the door. The northwest corner was the worst. It was always the worst. The 2 logs that met there had been fitted well. Elias was a careful builder, but careful building was not the same as perfect building, and perfect building would not have survived the first winter anyway. The wind found the corner the way water finds the low point in a field, not because it was looking, but because that was simply where the path of least resistance led. One morning, Eliza put her palm flat against the northwest corner and held it there. She said, "It feels like something breathing." Martha looked at her. Eliza said, in and out, "Like something on the other side is breathing on the wall." Martha said, "That is the wind." Eliza said, "It does not feel like wind. Wind is moving. This just comes in and comes in." Martha thought about this and decided Eliza was right. Wind moved. What came through the cracks was not exactly wind. It was the outside air asserting itself. finding the path the cracks provided, and following it, not with force, but with persistence, the way cold always worked. Persistence over force. A slow accumulation rather than a sudden blow. She added 2 more layers of clay to the northwest corner that day. They held for a week. Then the temperature dropped again, and in the morning, the clay on the northwest corner had cracked in 2 new places, and the thread of moving air was back. Patient as ever, Samuel, who had been watching his father chink and watching his mother chink and watching the cracks come back, asked one evening whether they would ever actually win. Elias said, "Win what?" Samuel said, "The cracks, keeping the cold out." Elias looked at the wall for a moment. Then he said, "You do not keep the cold out. You just keep it from winning too fast." Samuel thought about that. He looked at his marks on the bee, the bottom mark where he was, and the top mark where he had put the end of winter. He thought about the distance between them and the northwest corner where the wind came through and the 14 candles in the tin box on the middle shelf. He said, "How long does it take for cold to win too fast?" Elias said one night, "Without fire, that is all it takes." He said it the way he said most things. The way a man states a fact so familiar it has lost the power to frighten him, even though it has not lost the power to matter. One night, without fire. The cabin was 22 degrees warmer than the outside, on a good night with a good fire. Without the fire, that advantage evaporated in hours. The walls gave back no heat of their own. The floor gave back no heat. The only heat was the heat that burned. Samuel said nothing after that. He went to the woodpile beside the hearth and checked it the way his mother had taught him, touching the pieces to feel which were dry and which still held moisture, arranging them so the driest were on top and in front. Eliza was sitting on the floor near the hearth with her back against the warm stone, her knees pulled up, watching the fire. She had taken to watching the fire lately, not staring into it but observing it the way you observe a person, reading its moods. She had learned that a fire had moods. A fire with good dry oak spoke in a low, steady voice. A deep register crackle that meant everything was working. A fire with wet wood fussed and hissed, throwing more smoke than heat, complaining about what it had been given. A fire that was getting low went quiet in a particular way, its voice becoming smaller and more intermittent, pulling back toward the coals. She could tell the difference now. She could not have told anyone exactly how. She just could. That evening the wind shifted from the northwest to due north and increased, and the cabin registered it the way the cabin always registered changes in the wind, with a new set of sound, a new pressure on a different wall, a new cold spot migrating from one corner to another. Martha moved the children's sleeping arrangement 2 feet toward the center of the room without explanation. The cold had found the cracks. It would keep finding them all winter. The question was never whether the cold would get in. Some cold always got in. The question was how much, and whether the fire was big enough, and the people were careful enough to keep the answer to that question on the right side of survivable. Most nights it was. Most nights had to be enough. Martha had known since October. She had not known it as a fear. She had known it as a number, the way she knew most things. As a calculation she had run in September, when she was putting up the supplies, and running it again in October, when the supplies were in the cabin and she could see exactly what she had. The calculation had told her then what it was, telling her now in November they were going to be short before March. Not desperately short. The kind of short that meant the last 6 weeks of winter would require careful management. A polite way of saying that the portions would be smaller than anyone wanted, and the meals would be plainer than anyone preferred. And there would be days when the children were hungry, in the way that children who are not used to being hungry show it. She had decided in October to manage it from the beginning, not the end. Start being careful in November. While the adjustment was small enough that no one would notice clearly, small enough that it looked like the normal variation of cooking rather than the careful subtraction of a woman who knew the numbers. The flour was the first thing she changed. She had been making biscuits with 2 cups of flour for the batch. She went to 1 cup and 3/4. The biscuits were slightly smaller. She increased the water by a tablespoon to compensate for the texture so they did not come out dense. Nobody said anything. Elias ate his biscuits. Samuel ate his biscuit. Eliza ate her biscuits and then looked at the pan for a moment and looked at her mother and said nothing. Martha saw that look. She knew what it meant. She also knew that Eliza would not say anything, because Eliza, at 7, had a quality that most people did not develop until they were much older. The understanding that some things were being managed, and that the correct response to something being managed was to let it be managed. The salt pork was the second thing. She sliced it thinner by the width of a thumbnail, which over 60 pieces of salt pork meant she bought herself perhaps 4 additional days of meat. 4 days was 4 days. She took them. The beans she handled differently. She did not reduce the quantity. She increased the water they cooked in, letting them cook longer so they swelled more fully, and the broth thickened, and the bowl looked full because it was full. Just full of more broth and less bean than it had been in October. Samuel ate his beans and did not comment. Elias ate his beans and did not comment. Ruth ate what was put in front of her, with the complete acceptance of a child who had no basis for comparison. Eliza, again, looked at the bowl for a moment before she ate. Eliza said nothing. The dried apples Martha held back entirely, except for twice a week. In October she had used them more freely, stirring them into the evening porridge when the mood seemed to call for something that tasted like a different season. That was over now. Twice a week. She did not explain the change. It simply became the rhythm. Coffee was the hardest. Coffee was the thing that made 4:30 in the morning into something a person could do. She had 40 pounds of green coffee beans, and she had known since she counted them that 40 pounds was not a winter's worth if she made it the way she had been making it. She made it weaker. Not so weak that it became something else, just weak enough that the 40 pounds would last to April. This was the adjustment she felt most. Not in her stomach, but somewhere higher, in the part of a person that is held up by small, reliable pleasures. And she made it anyway, because it was necessary. Elias noticed the coffee. He said nothing about it for 2 weeks. Then, one evening, he poured his cup and held it and said, not as a complaint, just as an observation different. She said yes. He held the cup for a moment. He said all right. He drank his coffee. He never mentioned it again. She watched him drink it and felt something for him in that moment that she did not have a name for. Something in the neighborhood of gratitude, but older and less formal. The feeling a person has for someone who understands the terms of a situation without needing them explained and simply adjusts. The children she watched more carefully. Ruth was fine. Ruth ate what she was given and grew and slept and was, as far as Martha could tell, unaffected by the small subtractions. Samuel was growing. This was the problem with Samuel. He was 12 and had been doing the work of a man since September, and his body was responding to that work by becoming larger and requiring more. She watched him at supper and saw how he ate everything, and then looked at the pot with the careful look of a boy who had been raised not to ask for more, but was hungry. She gave him more. She did not give him her portion outright. Not in any way he could see. She simply served herself last and served herself less. And the arithmetic worked out so that Samuel had enough and she had adequate. She had done this before. In the first years of their marriage, when a bad year in Pennsylvania meant February ran short. She knew how to manage on adequate. The trick was to never think of it as sacrifice. The moment you named it sacrifice, it became a burden. She thought of it as arithmetic. The numbers worked out, or they did not, and you adjusted until they did, and you did not name the adjustments. One morning in late November, she opened the flour barrel before the family was awake and looked inside. She had known what she would find. She had been tracking it by feel, by the way the barrel lifted when she tipped it, by the sound of flour shifting inside when the level was high versus when it was not. She knew before she looked, but she looked anyway, because knowing a thing in the abstract and seeing it with your eyes were two different forms of knowing, and both were necessary. The flour was below the halfway mark, November, below halfway in November. She stood with her hand on the barrel and ran the arithmetic again. The number did not change. She was going to need to find another 8 weeks of flour somewhere inside the flour that was left. She could do it. She had done harder things with less, but it required that every morning from now until March, when she opened this barrel and took out what the day needed, she took out exactly what the day needed, and not 1 tablespoon more. She replaced the lid and turned and started the fire. Elias was still asleep. The children were still asleep. The cabin was cold and dark, and the fire was the first task. The fire was always the first task, and after the fire, the water, and after the water, the biscuits, and after the biscuits, the day. She did not tell Elias about the flour. She told him what she needed him to know when she needed him to know it. She did not need him to know this yet. What she needed him to know was that the fire was ready, and the water was on, and breakfast was coming, and the cabin was holding. All of that was true. All of that was enough for this morning. The cow's name was Belle. Elias had not named her. Samuel had named her 2 summers ago when she was a calf, and the name had stuck the way names stick when children give them, without ceremony and without anyone deciding to make it official. She was a red and white mixed breed, broad through the shoulders, with a disposition that ran toward patience rather than complaint, which was the disposition you wanted in a cow that was going to spend a Michigan winter in a log barn with a water trough that froze solid most mornings by 6. The barn was 20 feet from the cabin door. In July, 20 feet was nothing. In December, 20 feet in the dark, and the cold, and the wind, before sunrise, wearing everything you owned, and carrying a bucket that would begin to ice on the outside before you got back to the door. 20 feet was a commitment. Elias and Samuel made it every morning. They went to Bell first, then to the 4 chickens in their small pen at the back of the barn, then to the 2 hogs in the lean-to on the south side where the wall blocked the worst of the north wind. The hogs would be meat by February if everything went according to plan, which was a plan Martha had made in September and did not discuss with the children, particularly not with Eliza, who had a relationship with the hogs that Martha did not encourage but also did not see a way to prevent. The morning routine with the animals took 40 minutes on a good day and longer on every other kind. Water first, because the trough froze every night and had to be broken open with the back of an axe before Belle could drink. The sound of that axe on the ice carried back to the cabin clearly in the still morning air, and Martha had come to hear it as the first confirmation that the day was working, the way a person learns to hear a certain sound as safe. Then hay, forked down from the loft above. Then a check of Belle's condition, her back and shoulders, the state of her hooves, the way she stood. Elias ran his hands over her every morning the way he ran his hands over the cabin walls, looking for the small problems before they became large ones. Belle gave milk through December. Not as much as in summer, but enough. Enough for Ruth in the morning. Enough for the children's porridge. A small amount set aside in a covered crock near the hearth where it would not freeze. Martha used every drop. The whey from the little bit of cheese she managed to press went into the bean soup. Nothing was wasted, because nothing could afford to be wasted. The chickens were more difficult. 4 hens, kept in a small pen, insulated with extra hay, packed around the outside walls. They stopped laying reliably in November, which Martha had expected. On the days when she found an egg or 2 in the nesting box, she handled them the same way she handled the coffee and the dried apples, as something to be deployed strategically rather than enjoyed freely. She gave the eggs to the children. She served herself and Elias something else at those meals. Cornmeal porridge or a piece of pork. And if Elias noticed, he did not say so, and if he said nothing, she would continue not saying anything, and the eggs would continue going to the children. The hogs were the hardest. 2 hogs in a lean-to in a Michigan winter required feed and water and monitoring for the sickness that moved through pigs in cold weather. Elias checked them every day. They were large animals, well fattened from the summer, and they had come through November in good condition. But they ate. They ate significantly. And the feed Elias had set aside for them was going faster than he had planned because the cold was making their bodies burn more to stay warm. He had calculated for the cold. He had not calculated for this cold, for the particular sustained depth of it that Michigan territory delivered without the warming spells that had broken the worst of it in the 2 previous winters. He mentioned this to Martha one evening. He said, "The hogs are going through feed faster than I planned." She said, "How much faster?" He looked at the fire for a moment. He said, "Maybe 20%. She said nothing for a while. Then she said, "What happens if you slaughter one early?" He said, "We lose half the meat we planned for spring." She said, "What happens if you keep both and run out of feed in February?" He looked at her. She said, "I am not telling you what to do. I am asking you to think about which risk is worse." He sat with that for a long time. Finally, he said, "I will cut their portions back and see how they hold." She said, "All right." She went back to her mending. The hogs complained about the reduced portions in the loud, consistent way that hogs complained about anything they did not like. A sound that carried from the lean-to to the cabin, clearly enough that Samuel heard it, and asked why they were loud. Elias said, "They are hungry." Samuel said, "Like us?" Elias said, "Like everyone in December." Samuel thought about that, and then went back to oiling the leather harness straps to keep them from cracking in the cold. He had started doing this without being asked, which Martha noticed and filed without commenting on. The same way she had filed the morning he came down from the loft and built the fire before she got up, and the morning he had gone to the barn without waiting for his father. Small things that meant he was understanding that the system required everyone, and that everyone meant him too, fully, not as a child helping, but as a working part of something that needed all its parts. One night, in the second week of December, Martha woke at the usual hour to feed the hearth and heard bell. A low, repeated sound, the kind Belle made when something had shifted in her environment and she was registering it without knowing how to process it. Martha lay still and listened. She got up and went to the window and tried to see through the oiled paper, but could see nothing. Just the vague pale of the snow in the dark. She went back to the hearth and added the wood and stood for a moment listening. Elias was awake beside her without her realizing it. He said quietly, "I will go." She said, "It may be nothing." He was already pulling on his boots. He went out with the lantern and was back in 15 minutes. He came in and stood at the hearth and said, "She is fine." A tree came down at the edge of the clearing. Just the noise. Martha said, "All right." He went back to bed. She stayed at the hearth for a few minutes longer, listening to Belle settle back into silence, across the 20 feet of dark and cold between the cabin and the barn. She thought about all the things the winter required that could not be calculated in advance. They could only be done when they were required to be done. Elias understood that. He had been up and dressed and out the door before she had said 3 words. Not because she had asked him to, but because the system required it, and he was part of the system, and he knew his part. She went back to bed. Outside, the snow had started again, soft and quiet, covering the place where the tree had fallen. Belle was quiet. The night continued, as nights in December continued, one cold hour at a time. The cabin holding what it held, the fire burning what it burned, the family doing their part of the overnight work simply by breathing, simply by being alive and warm in the room where the hearth burned, and the animals 20 feet away endured the dark and the cold and the morning that was coming, and would require all of them again. The last time Elias had been to Caleb Morse's place was the second week of October, walking the 3 miles in 40 minutes on ground that was hard and clear and obvious. The trail through the woods as readable as a sentence, the light lasting until well past 5. The cold, nothing more than a pleasantness in the air. That walk took 40 minutes. The walk he made on the 3rd Tuesday of December took 2 hours and 10 minutes. Because he was careful, and being careful was the only reason he made it there and back at all. He had a reason to go. Morse had a supply of salve that Elias knew he kept for livestock wounds, and Belle had developed a raw place on her left shoulder where the halter had rubbed through 3 weeks of daily wear in cold conditions. Not serious yet. The kind of thing that was not serious yet but could become serious and a small amount of salve applied early made that difference disappear. He told Martha he was going. She said, "What time are you leaving?" He said, "After breakfast." She looked at the window, at the flat, white light coming through the oiled paper. She ran the arithmetic of daylight and distance, and returned quickly and without showing the work. She said, "You need to be back before the light goes." He said, "I know." She said, "The light goes at 4:15 now." He said, "I know." "Martha?" She handed him the extra pair of wool socks she had knitted in November and told him to put them on under his boots. He put them on. Samuel watched his father prepare from across the room, with the careful attention he brought to things he was not sure he fully understood. He watched Elias wrap his scarf twice around his neck and tuck the ends inside his coat. He watched him check the lacing on his boots. Samuel said, "How will you find the trail?" Elias said, "I know where it is." Samuel said, "The snow covered it." Elias said, "I know where the trees are. The trail is where the trees are not." He went out. Martha went to the window. She could not see him through the paper after about 30 seconds. When he entered the tree line, after that, there was just the gray-white of the yard and the line of trees and the sky that sat on everything. She went back to the fire. She spent that morning doing the things that needed doing. She made the morning cornmeal and got the children fed and checked the flour barrel and adjusted the day's portions and mended the knee of Samuel's trousers and nursed the fire and helped Eliza practice her letters on the back of a piece of bark with a piece of charcoal. She did not look at the window more than was natural. Natural was approximately every 12 minutes. The woods Elias walked through were not the pleasant autumn woods of October. The snow on the ground was 18 inches deep in the open and deeper under the trees where it had drifted. And it had a crust on it from a warm afternoon 3 days ago and the refreeze since then. A crust that held a man's weight for one step and then broke through on the next, so that every stride was uneven. 1 foot on top and 1 foot punching through to the knee. The energy required to cover 3 miles this way was not the energy required to cover 3 miles on clear ground. He sweated despite the cold. He stopped twice to let his breathing settle. The trail was where the trees were not, which was true, but where the trees were not was not always obvious. When the snow had rounded everything into gentle shapes, and the light came from all directions at once, in the flat gray way of overcast December, throwing no shadows, giving no depth. He went by memory, and by the lean of the land, and by 2 bent birches that marked the halfway point, which he had noted in October, for a reason he had not articulated to himself then, but understood. Now, you marked the things that would help you when the landscape became illegible. Caleb Morse's cabin was 3 miles north. When Elias arrived, Morse opened the door before he knocked. He said, "Saw you coming through the trees for 20 minutes?" Elias stepped inside and stood near Morse's hearth and felt the particular relief of warmth on a face that has been cold for a long time. He accepted the cup of coffee that Morse's wife gave him without being asked. He said, "Belle has a sore shoulder." Morse went and found the salve and gave it over without discussion, the way men in that country gave things a neighbor needed, because the calculation of mutual survival was simple enough that it did not require explanation. You helped when you could, because the day would come when you needed help, and the distance between cabins was the same distance in both directions. They talked for 20 minutes. Morse told him the trail to the east toward the settlement had been passable as of a week ago, but he could not speak for it now. He told him the creek that ran between their two properties would be solid enough to cross on foot by January if the cold held. Then he told him about a man named Thomas, an Ojibwe man who stopped at his place in November. The same man who had come by the previous 2 winters. Elias said, "What did he say?" Morse said, "He said, look at the squirrels in September. How high they cached their food." Elias said, "I did not look at the squirrels in September." Morse said, "Neither did I. But Thomas did." He said, higher than the 2 years before." Elias was quiet. Morse said, "Thomas has been reading this country his whole life, and his father read it before him, and his grandfather before that. I have been here 6 years, and I have learned that when Thomas says something about what this land is doing, I listen to it." Elias finished his coffee. He stood up and put on his coat. He walked back through the December woods the same way he had come, following the lean of the land and the bent birches and the memory of where the trail had been. He went slowly. He thought about Thomas and the squirrel caches and the 4 cords of wood at home and the flour barrel below the halfway mark. He thought about what it meant to read a piece of land, to actually know it, not from a season or a year, but from a lifetime and a lifetime before that. To know what the squirrels were telling you, and what the creek ice meant, and which way the storms came before you could see them coming. He had been here 2 years. He knew where the bent birches were. He did not know what the squirrels were saying in September. He came out of the tree line into his own yard at 3:45. 30 minutes before the light would go, the cabin window was lit from inside. A warm yellow through the oiled paper. The woodpile stood against the south wall. The barn was quiet. He stood in the yard for a moment before going in. He looked at the tree line he had just come through. 3 miles of winter woods that he had navigated on memory, and the angle of the land, and 2 bent birches. 3 miles that in June was a pleasant walk. 3 miles that in December was the exact distance between his family and the nearest help, if something went wrong here and he was not home to handle it. He thought about Samuel watching from the window. He went inside. Martha looked at him once. A full look, taking in his color and his movement and the fact that he was standing upright and his eyes were clear. She handed him a cup of coffee without saying anything. He sat down near the hearth and held the cup in both hands. After a while he said, "Morse sends his regards." She said, "How is he?" He said, "Fine." "His family is fine?" She said, "Did you get the salve?" He said, "Yes." She went back to the pot. He sat with his coffee and thought about Thomas and about squirrels and about what it meant to know something deeply enough that the land told you things before they happen. He thought about the flour barrel and the woodpile and the winter that Morse had suggested could run long. He did not tell Martha about the squirrels yet. He would tell her when he had thought about it long enough to know what he wanted to say. For now the fire was burning, and the cabin was holding its temperature, and his family was in the room, and the salve was in his pack, and the walk was done. He drank his coffee. Outside, 3 miles north, Caleb Morse's cabin put up its smoke in the still late afternoon air. 2 threads of smoke rising from 2 separate chimneys into the pewter sky, visible to each other, if either man had been standing outside and looking, which neither was. 2 cabins, 3 miles apart, in all that cold and all that quiet, close enough to reach in an emergency, far enough that an emergency had to wait for the weather to permit it. That was the distance. That was what 3 miles meant in December, in Michigan Territory, in the winter of 1836. It was not very far. It was another country. The morning of December 23rd, the cow was sick. Not dramatically sick. The kind of sick that shows in the standing weight shifted to the back legs. Head carried lower than usual. The slow blink of an animal that has spent more energy overnight than it should have and has less left than it needs. Elias came out of the barn and into the cabin and said nothing. He ate his breakfast and went back out. Martha watched him go. She did not ask because she knew. She had heard it in the way he had moved through the barn the first time. The extra minutes he had taken before coming in. The particular silence of a man looking at something he was not yet ready to name. She waited. At mid-morning, he came in for the salve, and she asked him then. He said she is off. Something in the cold last night. She drank this morning, but she did not eat well. Martha said the temperature dropped hard after midnight. He said, I know. I should have put more hay down for her before bed. She looked at him. She said, You could not have known how far it was going to drop. He said I should have put more hay down anyway. He went back out. This was the thing about Elias that Martha had understood for years. He held himself accountable for outcomes he could not have controlled, which made him careful and thorough in the ways that mattered, and which also made him hard on himself in the ways that did not help anything. She could not change this about him. She had learned instead to give him the time he needed to work through it and come out the other side into the practical action that always followed. He spent most of that day in the barn. Samuel went with him after the morning work, not because Elias asked him, but because Samuel had been watching Belle since the first week of December, with the focused attention he brought to things he had decided were his responsibility. Belle had become his responsibility in a way that nobody had officially assigned and nobody needed to. He had started this in October, when Elias showed him how to check the halter fit. He had done it again a week later without being told. Then daily, with the addition of the trough ice breaking, which he began doing before Elias came out in the mornings. The sound of the axe on the ice carrying back to the cabin and into Martha's awareness each dawn as the first confirmation that the day had started properly. Now he sat in the straw beside Belle and said nothing for a long time. Elias applied the salve to her shoulder and checked her gums and her eyes and stood back and looked at her. Samuel said, "What do we do?" Elias said, "Keep her warm. Get her eating again if we can. Watch her." Samuel said, "She will be all right." Elias was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "I think so. She is strong. She just had a hard night." Samuel sat with Belle for most of the afternoon. Talking to her, in the low, quiet way, he talked to animals. Not the sentimental talk of a child with a pet, but the practical, reassuring talk of someone who understood that animals responded to sound even when they did not understand it. He forked fresh hay down from the loft. He broke the ice on the trough again at midday, even though it had not fully refrozen, just to be doing something useful. That evening, Belle ate about 2/3 of what Elias put in front of her, but she ate it steadily and without hesitation, and she stood squarely on all four legs when she was done, and turned to look at Samuel in the particular bovine way that meant she was present and aware and conducting her own assessment of the situation. Samuel sat very still and looked back at her. Then he went inside. He did not say anything about it at supper. He ate and listened to his father talk about the wood he planned to cut the next day, and his mother talked to Ruth about why Ruth could not have the last of the dried apple before bed, and Eliza described a dream she had about a river that ran uphill, which she seemed to find entirely plausible. Later, when the supper things were cleared, Samuel went to the east wall and found his knife and made the evening mark in the beam. He ran his thumb from the bottom mark, which was October, and the beginning, up toward the top mark, which was March, and what he had decided was the end. He was somewhere in the lower third of it, more than half the winter still ahead by his reckoning, which had been revised once already as the cold proved longer and more consistent than he had anticipated. He had pressed the top mark further up the beam with some reluctance, not because moving it was hard, but because moving it meant acknowledging that his first estimate had been wrong. And he was a boy who had inherited from both parents a strong preference for being right about things he had committed to. But he moved it because the alternative was pretending the mark was right when it was not. And pretending did not change when the thaw came. He put the knife away and went to the window and looked out at the barn. The barn was dark. No light came through the gaps in the boards. Everything was still. Belle was in there. She had eaten 2/3 of her hay that evening and stood square on 4 legs and looked at him. She had come through a bad night and a worse morning, and she had eaten. He did not know exactly what to do with the feeling this gave him. It was not a large feeling. It was more like the feeling of a calculation coming out on the right side, after you had been working it and not been sure. The particular quiet satisfaction of a number that resolves. He went to bed. 2 days later, on Christmas morning, Belle ate her full portion. Martha had made cornmeal with dried apple and a spoon of the last of the sugar, which she had been reserving for exactly this kind of occasion, without telling anyone she was reserving it. Ruth ate her bowl and looked into it with the expression of a child registering that something was different and better and not quite understanding why. Eliza looked at her bowl and then looked at her mother with complete understanding and said, "Only thank you." Samuel ate his bowl and then said, "Belle ate everything this morning." Elias said, "I know. I saw." Samuel said, "All of it. Not just most of it." Elias said, "Yes." Samuel looked at his bowl. Then he looked up and said, "I think she is going to be all right." Elias looked at his son across the table. He held the look for a moment, in the way he held looks when he was measuring something. Then he nodded once. A single, slow nod. The kind that meant he had taken the thing Samuel said and found it worth agreeing with. That was all. It was enough. Martha watched this exchange from the hearth, where she was refilling the pot, and felt something she did not name because she did not name things like this. Just filed them in the place where she kept the things that were good, the place that needed to stay stocked through a long winter as surely as the flour barrel did. 2 days before Christmas, on a morning when the temperature had dropped to the point where the air hurt to breathe, Samuel had gone to the creek alone for the first time. Not alone in the sense of without permission, alone in the sense that Elias was at the woodpile and the errand could not wait, and Samuel knew the path and had the axe and made the decision himself to go. The creek was a 1/4 mile through the trees. He found the water hole they had been using, now frozen over with several inches of new ice. He set his feet and swung the axe and hit it, and the ice held. He swung again and again. On the 4th swing, a crack ran across the surface, and a section broke free, and he got the axe under it and levered it out and the dark water showed beneath. He filled both buckets. He had done this before with his father. Many times. He had done it once alone in November, but spilled half of one bucket on the way back when he slipped on an iced route. He had said nothing about the spill to anyone. He had refilled the bucket and walked back more carefully and delivered the water and gone on with the day. This time he did not spill. He walked back through the trees with both buckets full, moving at the pace the terrain required, reading the ground ahead the way he had learned to read it. Over 2 months of doing this same walk in the same conditions, he felt the weight of the water pulling at his arms, and he let his body adjust to it. The slight lean forward, the slow, careful stride that kept the buckets level. He came through the tree line into the yard. He got the cabin door open with 2 fingers of his right hand while keeping the bucket steady, and went inside and set both buckets on the shelf beside the hearth. Full, unspilled, without ceremony. Martha looked at the buckets. She looked at him. She said, "Good?" That was the whole of it. Samuel went back outside and broke the ice on Belle's trough for the midday watering, and forked hay from the loft, and did the rest of the things that needed doing. But the word stayed with him, not because it was high praise, because it was accurate. He had done the thing and it had worked, and the word his mother used was the right word for what had happened. And the rightness of it was the whole of the satisfaction. He added the week's mark to the beam that evening and ran his thumb from the beginning to where he was. He thought about Belle eating her full portion. He thought about the 2 full buckets. He thought about the sound of the axe on the creek ice, and the dark water showing underneath, and the walk back through the trees without spilling. He thought about his father's nod. He put the knife away. Outside, the temperature was dropping again for the night, pressing in from the north, looking for what the cabin would give up. The woodpile stood against the south wall. The barn held Belle and the chickens and the hogs, all of them working through their own versions of this winter. The hearth was going well on dry oak. It would hold until 2. At 2, Martha would get up and feed it again, the way she always got up and fed it again. Inside the one room that was home, in the last days of December, in the winter of 1836, the Whitaker family went to sleep. Belle was eating. The water buckets were full. The fire was burning. For this one quiet evening, in the long middle of a long winter, that was everything. Before the Whitakers, before Caleb Morse, before any cabin stood in this particular bend of the river valley in what would become the state of Michigan, the winter came here the same way it came now, down from the north, out of Canada, over the Great Lakes, finding the river valleys and the forest corridors, and following them south until it had covered everything it intended to cover. The same cold, the same depth of snow, the same freeze that worked into the ground and held it until March, the same northwest wind that found the corners of whatever stood in its path. The land did not know a difference between then and now. What was different was who read it. For generations before Elias Whitaker drove his first stake into this ground, the Ojibwe people had lived through these winters not as a crisis to be survived, but as a season to be known. Knowing is the right word. Not endured, not overcome, known, in the way you know a difficult thing, with the full understanding that the difficulty is permanent and the only useful response is attention. They knew which slopes the snow loaded heaviest, and which released it in slides without warning. They knew which stretches of the river stayed open longest and which sealed themselves under ice by November. They knew that when the squirrels cached their stores high in the oaks in September, it meant the snow would come deep and stay long. They knew which trees bent under ice without breaking, and which shattered, and which direction the shattering most often went. This was not magic. It was knowledge accumulated over time, the same way any knowledge accumulates, through observation and memory, and the passing of both from one generation to the next. The same process by which Martha Whitaker knew to feel the flour barrel's weight rather than just looking at it. The same process by which Elias knew that a fire needs oak behind the maple if it is going to hold through the night. Knowledge earned, knowledge kept, knowledge specific to a place. Thomas, the Ojibwe man who stopped at Caleb Morse's cabin twice a year on a route that had nothing to do with where the settlers had drawn their boundaries, had told Morse about the squirrel caches in September. He had offered the observation the way a man who knows something offers it to someone who might find it useful, without requiring them to understand the whole tradition it came from. Morse had listened. Elias, hearing it second-hand on a December afternoon. I had thought about it on the walk home through the winter woods and had not known what to do with it except hold it. The trail that Elias followed through those woods, the one he described to Samuel as the place where the trees were not, was not a trail he had made. He had cleared some brush on it in his first summer here, and he thought of it as something he had created. But below the surface of the snow, below the layer he had cleared, there was an older depression in the ground, worn down by feet that had passed this way for longer than he had been alive. He felt it sometimes, in the way the ground was slightly lower there, slightly more packed, in the way his feet seemed to follow it, without quite knowing why. The clearing where he had built his cabin had been a clearing before he arrived, not large, but already open to the sky, in a way that clearings become open when something has used them repeatedly over time. He had assumed it was a natural clearing. He had not looked closely at the edges, at the old fire circles, under the first season's growth, at the way certain stones had been arranged along the northern edge in a line that did not occur in nature. He had needed a clearing. There was one. He had built there. The Whitakers were not the first people to find this bend in the river valley, a reasonable place to shelter through a winter. They were the first people in their family to try. They were newcomers to a place that was not new, on a land that had been understood and used and named long before they arrived to rename it. New in the way that means you do not yet know what you do not know. New in the way that means the knowledge you need is somewhere in this ground and in these trees and in the depth of the squirrel caches in September. And you have not been here long enough to have earned it. Caleb Morse was working toward that knowledge. 6 years. And he could feel himself beginning to read this particular piece of land the way it needed to be read. He was not there yet. Elias Whitaker was in his 2nd year. He knew where the bent birches were. He knew the trail between his cabin and Morse's. He knew that Bell needed to be watched in hard cold, and that the northwest corner of his cabin would never stop finding new cracks. He did not yet know what the squirrels were telling him in September. He would learn if he stayed, if the winters permitted him to stay. He would learn, not all of it, never all of it. but enough to read a little more of what was written here in the snow and the trees and the behavior of the animals and the depth of the cold. The land did not withhold this knowledge deliberately. It simply required time. The winter continued. The creek froze and thawed and froze again, as it had always done, carrying no opinion about who brought the axe to it in the mornings. Elias knew before he touched it. He knew from the quality of the light coming through the oiled paper window. That flat pressed white, that meant the sky and the ground had become the same color. But this was not the gentle white of the first snow. This was a white with weight behind it, a white that had been worked on all night by something serious. He knew from the silence. Michigan Territory winter had its own sounds. The wind and the creak of the trees and the occasional crack of a branch taking more ice than it could hold. What it did not have, on a normal morning, was this nothing, complete nothing, the particular silence of a world that had been packed in, sealed from itself. He got up and went to the door. He lifted the bar. He put his hand on the latch and pressed down and pushed. The door did not move. He pushed again, with his shoulder this time, the way the door sometimes required in wet weather, when the wood swelled in the frame. The door gave perhaps a quarter inch and stopped, held from the outside by something that was not the latch or the bar or anything that lived inside the cabin. He stood for a moment with his palm flat against the wood. Martha was awake behind him. He could tell by her breathing, the shift from the slow rhythm of sleep to the faster, quieter breathing of a person listening. He said, without turning snow against the door. She said, how much? He put his eye to the gap between the door and the frame, the thin line of light there, and tried to see out. What he saw was white, not the white of sky or yard, the white of packed snow, filling the gap completely, flush with the door, as though someone had plastered the outside of the cabin overnight. He said enough. He pulled on his boots and his coat. Samuel was down from the loft by then, having heard enough in his father's voice to know that coming down was the right thing to do. He stood at the foot of the ladder and looked at the door. He said, what do we do? Elias said, I need to get eyes on it from above. He looked at the loft. Can you get to the vent up there? Samuel was already going up. The loft had a small opening in the north gable, left deliberately for ventilation and covered with a piece of hinged wood that could be propped open in summer. Samuel had never opened it in winter. He climbed to it now and worked the wooden prop loose with his fingers and pushed. It opened 3 inches and stopped. He pushed harder. Something gave on the other side. A compressed mass of snow yielding slowly, and the gap opened to 6 inches, and he got his face to it and looked out. He pulled back and came down the ladder. He said, it is up to the eave on the north side. Elias looked at him. Samuel said, maybe higher? I can see the top of it from the vent. It is above the vent. Martha had been standing at the hearth, and she said nothing for a moment. Then she said the south side will be lower. The wind was from the north all night. Elias nodded. He went back up the ladder with Samuel. They worked the vent open together, taking turns pressing against the snow on the other side. 6 inches becoming 8, becoming a foot. The snow compacting and then beginning to fall away in chunks as the gap widened. Cold air poured through the opening and fell straight down into the loft, and Martha below could feel it from the main room. A new cold, outdoor cold. The real temperature of that morning entering the cabin for the first time. Eliza was standing at the base of the ladder. She had come down quietly and was watching with the careful attention she brought to everything she was not sure about. Baby Ruth sat up on her pallet near the hearth, looking at the activity with wide eyes. Martha said to Eliza, "Put your coat on and Ruth's coat." "Do it now?" Eliza did it. Samuel got through the vent. It was a 10-inch opening, and he was 12 years old, and it was tight, and it was not a thing a grown man could have done. And this was the moment when Samuel understood that his size, which had never seemed like an advantage before, was today the most important thing about him. He went through head first with his father holding his feet, and then released into the outside world in a cascade of displaced snow, and landed on his hands and knees on the surface of a drift that was level with the eave of the cabin. He stood up. The world was white and silent and enormous. The snow had drifted from the north so that the north side of the cabin was buried to the roofline, and the south side had a drift perhaps 3 feet deep against the wall, still more than enough to hold the door. He could see where the door was. Or rather, he could see a smooth, unbroken, white surface where the door had been. He found the shovel. It had been left leaning against the south wall under the small eave overhang, and the handle was sticking up above the drift. He began to dig. He had dug paths and cleared the woodpile and broken creek ice for 2 months. And his body knew this work now. The rhythm of the shovel and the throw and the step and the next bite of the blade. He worked down from the top of the drift toward the door, throwing the snow to his right, clearing a channel, feeling with the blade for the solid resistance of the door beneath the white. He found it at about 4 feet of depth. He cleared the snow from the face of the door and packed the sides of the channel and came around to the front and knocked. He said, "I am here. I am at the door." He heard his father's voice from inside, close against the wood. He heard the bar being lifted. The door opened inward, and the snow that had been against it fell forward into the channel. And Elias stood in the doorway, looking out at his son, standing in a hole in the snow with the shovel in his hands and the white world stretching away behind him. Elias said, "Good work." He said it the way he said the things he meant, without excess, without elaboration. Samuel climbed out of the channel and stood in the yard. The yard was gone. The fence rails were gone. The path to the barn was gone. The surface of the snow was smooth and unbroken, except for the channel he had dug and the marks his knees had made when he came through the vent. The oak tree at the edge of the clearing, the tree that Eliza had watched disappear in the first snow and slowly reappear over the weeks since, was reduced to a rounded hump with a suggestion of branches above it. The whole lower half swallowed. The world was very quiet. Samuel stood in it for a moment and understood something he could not have put into words, that the world the snow made was not the world they lived in. It was a replacement world, installed overnight without asking, and the world they lived in was still there underneath it. The paths and the fence rails and the familiar shapes of things. But it was underneath, and would require work to reach. He started on the path to the barn. Inside the cabin, Martha had put the kettle on and was moving through the morning routine with the precise efficiency of a woman who had been briefly interrupted by something significant and was now returning to what needed doing. She fed Ruth and got the cornmeal going, and sent Eliza to the woodpile for the morning's wood. Eliza opened the door and looked out at the channel Samuel had dug and the white world beyond it. She stood in the doorway for a long moment. She said, "The oak is gone." Martha said, "Just buried. It will come back when the snow goes." Eliza said, "How does it know to come back?" Martha looked at her. Eliza said, "When the snow covers it, how does the tree know it is still a tree?" Martha was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "It knows, because it has been a tree longer than the snow has been here." Eliza stood with that for a moment. Then she went for the wood. By 10 o'clock the path was clear and the barn was open, and Belle had her morning water and hay, and the chickens were fed, and the hogs were fed, and the 2 full buckets of water stood on the shelf beside the hearth. The door of the cabin stood open for the first time since November. Not wide open, just a foot, enough to let in a thin column of winter light that crossed the floor at an angle and hit the far wall, where it had not hit since October. Martha stood at the hearth and looked at that light on the wall. She left the door open for 20 minutes, long enough to clear some of the accumulated smoke from the loft, long enough for the room to remember that there was a world outside it. Then she closed the door. The column of light disappeared. The familiar shadows returned. The hearth burned. It began in the afternoon, not with violence, with a change in the quality of the air. Something that Elias felt when he stepped outside to check the woodpile at 2 o'clock and stood for a moment with his face turned north. The temperature was already low, had been low all day. But what changed in the afternoon was the pressure behind it, the sense of something gathering itself somewhere to the north and beginning to move. He brought in 3 extra loads of wood. Martha watched him do this without comment. When he brought in the 4th load, she said, "How bad do you think?" He said, "I do not know. Bad enough to prepare for." She nodded and went to check the water buckets and the flour barrel, and the status of the things that would matter if the cabin needed to stay closed for an extended period. She did not tell him the numbers. She ran them herself and made the adjustments she could make and left the ones she could not. By 4 o'clock, the snow had started. By 5, it was serious. The wind came with it, from the northwest first, and then swinging north, and then northwest again, the way bad storms move through Michigan territory. Not in a straight line, but in the variable way of something large finding its own path. The cabin registered each shift. The northwest corner, always the first to know, began its pressure sounds, the low, steady moan that had been the background of so many nights this winter. Then the north wall joined it. Then the sound at the door changed from the seeping whisper of ordinary cold to something more insistent, a pulse against the wood that came and went with the gusts. Elias banked the fire high and told the children to stay in from the loft for the night. They slept in the main room, Samuel and Eliza on pallets near the hearth with Ruth between them, Martha and Elias against the south wall. The arrangement compact and close in the way the cabin required when the cold was serious enough to matter. The storm did not roar. This was the thing about a real winter storm, that nobody who had not been inside a log cabin during one could fully anticipate. From outside, it was a roaring thing, the wind loud and the snow horizontal and the trees working hard against it. But inside, with the walls between you and the weather, the sound was different. The walls took the violence and translated it into something else, into pressure and vibration and a low, continuous note that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere. It sounded like being inside something. Elias lay awake in the early part of the night and listened to the storm speak through the cabin. The northwest corner first. Always. That low moan that rose and fell with the gusts. Then the door. The pulse against the wood coming in irregular intervals. Sometimes 3 hard beats, close together, and then a pause, long enough that you thought the gust had passed before the next one hit. The fire responded to the pressure changes, ducking down when the wind hit hard and recovering in the silence between gusts. The flames pulling toward the flue and then steadying. The gust came and the fire went low and the room dimmed. Then the gust passed and the fire rose and the room brightened. This happened again and again through the early hours. The hearth breathing with the storm. In and out. The light in the cabin pulsing like something alive. Then around midnight the sound changed. The wind did not stop, but the snow got heavy enough, the air thick enough with it, that the world outside the cabin walls became muffled in a way the earlier hours had not. The sharp edges of the wind sound softened. The sound of the trees, which had been audible through the walls all evening, went away. The world outside was being packed in, wrapped in the white weight of itself, and the sounds it made were traveling through more and more snow to reach the cabin walls and arriving quieter and quieter. Until after midnight, there was almost nothing from outside, just the cabin. The gust came, and the fire went low, and the room dimmed. The gust passed, and the fire rose, and the room brightened. The northwest corner moaned. The door pulsed. These sounds, which had been the background of the storm, were now the only sounds, and in the absence of everything else, they became very clear and very specific. The particular voice of this cabin on this night, the sound of 4 walls and a hearth and a roof doing what they had been built to do, against something that was doing its best to find what they had gotten wrong. Martha was awake. She lay in the dark and listened to the storm speak through the cabin, and thought about the woodpile and how many of the extra loads Elias had brought in tonight were already gone into the fire. She thought about whether the roof could hold the snow accumulating on it, and she thought about the chinking on the northwest corner, how many times it had been repacked, and whether the last packing was holding. She thought about Belle in the barn. She thought about Ruth's breathing. She turned her head and listened. Ruth was there, 3 years old, and deeply asleep, the breathing light and even and completely untroubled. Eliza was awake. Martha could tell from the quality of her stillness, the stillness of a child listening, not sleeping. She said quietly, "Eliza." Eliza said yes. Martha said, "You are all right." Eliza was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "I am listening to it." Martha said to the storm. Eliza said to the cabin, "The storm is outside. The cabin is in here. They are different." Martha lay in the dark with that. She said, "What does the cabin sound like?" Eliza listened for a moment. Then she said, like something that is working hard but not breaking. Martha thought about this. She said, "Yes, that is right." Elias was on his back looking at the ceiling. He had been listening since midnight to the particular sounds of this cabin under this storm. The roof was sound. He had reseated 2 loose boards in October, and the rest were tight. The walls were as tight as 3 sessions of chinking could make them. The door bar was down, and the leather hinges, which he had intended to replace since November and had not replaced, were holding or they were not, and he would know in the morning. He got up at 1:30 and added 2 pieces of oak to the fire without being asked by anyone, just as a precaution, just as the contribution of a man who was awake and could do something useful while he was awake. He lay back down. At some point in the early morning the wind dropped, and the sound of the outside world began to return through the walls. The trees audible again, their deep creak restored. The snow was lightening. Samuel heard it from his pallet, and turned over and went deeper into sleep. Eliza heard it, and stayed where she was, still listening. She heard the difference between the storm and what came after. The storm had been one sound, a continuous pressing thing. What followed was many sounds. The trees, and the wind, and the settling of snow, and something like quiet moving in at the edges. She thought about what she had said to her mother, like something that is working hard but not breaking. She pressed her palm against the wall beside her pallet and felt the cold of it through her hand. The wall was cold. It was always cold on the inside when the outside was this cold. But it was there. It was solid under her hand. The log rough and real and present. The cabin had not broken. She had listened to it all night, and it had not broken. She closed her eyes. In the morning, Elias went to the northwest corner and ran his hand along the chinking he had repacked twice already that winter. The section he had been most careful with, the section he had pressed in with extra clay in November and reinforced in December and believed was holding. A long crack had opened in the night, following the grain of the dried clay, splitting it cleanly from the log above to the log below. He stood with his fingers in the gap and felt the cold coming through, steady and patient, as it always was. And he understood something that the winter had been trying to tell him since October. Good work was not permanent work. Good work was work that lasted until the next thing came. The next freeze, the next thaw, the next storm, the next test of what he had built and how well he had built it. He had believed, when he first packed that corner in October, that he was solving a problem. He understood now that he was not solving a problem. He was managing one. The crack would come back. He would repack it. It would come back again. That was not failure. That was the work. He went and got the clay bucket and repacked the corner for the 3rd time. He did it without frustration. He did it the way Martha measured out the flour each morning, knowing the barrel was going down and measuring carefully, because careful was all there was. He pressed the clay in and smoothed the surface and stepped back and looked at it. It would hold until it did not. He would repack it when it did not. That was the whole of it. Outside, the storm was finished. The snow coming down now, in the thick, slow curtain of a system that had used up most of its force. The world outside the cabin was deep and white and silent. Inside, the hearth burned. The family breathed. Morning was coming, and with it, the work of finding what the storm had changed and what it had not. But that was morning. For the last hours of darkness, the cabin held what it held, and the storm was behind them now, spent and going, and the cabin was still standing. The door would open in the morning. It would take some work, but it would open. Martha knew on a Wednesday. Eliza ate her breakfast. She finished it. She did everything that constituted a normal morning, but she ate slowly in a way that was different from how she usually ate slowly. And she sat at the table after she was done and did not get up the way she usually got up. And when Samuel said something to her that would normally have gotten a response, she looked at him for a moment before answering, as if the words were arriving from a slight distance. Martha filed it and said nothing. At noon she found Eliza sitting on her pallet with her knees pulled up and her back against the wall. Not playing, just sitting. Martha crossed the room and sat beside her and put the back of her hand against Eliza's forehead. She held it there. Then she stood up and went back to the fire and said nothing to anyone until evening, when the children were settled and Elias was at the hearth checking the wood situation for the night. She said, quietly, "Eliza has a fever." Elias turned from the hearth. She said, "It is not high yet. She is drinking. She is alert, but it is there, and it is not going away on its own tonight." He said, "How bad do you think?" She said, "I do not know yet. I am watching her. This is what I have and what I am doing with it." She told him this way, the practical inventory way, because that was the way information was useful. Not, "I am frightened," though she was. Not, "What if it gets worse?" though she had already run that calculation twice. Just, "This is what I know, and this is what I am doing, and this is what I need from you." What she needed from him was what she always needed from him, for him to continue doing the things he did, the wood and the water and the animals, so that she could concentrate entirely on what was happening inside this one room. He said, "What do you need?" She said, "Keep the fire up, hotter than usual, and check the water before you sleep. I will need it warm when I need it." He said, "All right." That was the whole of that conversation. The problem with sickness in a one-room cabin was the geometry. There was no separate space. There was no room to put Eliza away from the cold. No room to give her the warm air without the smoke. No room that was just hers, where the particular requirements of a sick child could be met without conflicting with the requirements of everything else happening in the same 16 by 18 feet. The fire was the heart of it. A sick child needed warmth. Warmth came from the fire. The fire was also the only source of heat for cooking, and for the water Martha needed warm, and for keeping the room survivable for everyone else. A fire kept high in a sealed cabin put smoke in the air. The small, accumulating particles that on a normal day were merely unpleasant, and on a day when a child was coughing, became something Martha thought about carefully. She opened the door twice in the first morning. Briefly, 2 minutes each time, letting the cold rush in, and the smoke roll out, and the air of the cabin reset itself. The temperature dropped noticeably each time. She watched Eliza when she did it, watched her pull the blanket tighter, and weighed the cold air against the clean air, and decided that for now, at this level of fever, clean air was worth the cold. She did not know if she could make that same calculation later. She moved Eliza's pallet to the position closest to the hearth, while still keeping her out of the direct smoke path. She built up the pallet with the extra blanket from the bottom of the trunk, the one she had been keeping in reserve. She tucked it under and around Eliza with the efficiency of a woman who knew exactly how to build warmth around a small body. Eliza said, "I am hot." Martha said, "I know. The fever makes you feel that way. You are going to feel both hot and cold at the same time, and that is the fever, not the room." Eliza said, "That does not make sense." Martha said, "No, it does not, but it is true." Eliza lay back. The medicine box on the high shelf had what it had: a small paper of willow bark, which Martha brewed into a tea and gave Eliza in careful doses through the day. A bottle of whiskey, added to warm water in a small amount, enough to help her sleep. Dried peppermint from the summer's harvest, brewed weak and sweetened with the last of the sugar, given as much for the warmth and the comfort of the sweetness as for any other reason. These were not medicine in the way a doctor meant medicine. They were the gestures toward medicine available in a cabin 3 miles from the nearest neighbor and considerably further from anyone with formal training. Martha knew what they were. She used them anyway because warm liquid and rest and warmth were not nothing. They were, in fact, most of what a body needed to fight. What a body needed to fight. The nearest settlement was 12 miles east. The trail to the settlement had not been passable in 3 weeks. She did not think about the settlement. She thought about the willow bark and the water temperature and the way Eliza's breathing sounded and whether it was changing. The second night was the hard one. The fever went up in the way fevers went up in the evening. The body running its own internal campaign that showed in the heat of the skin and the particular brightness of the eyes. Too bright. The brightness of something working at a level it could not sustain indefinitely. Elias moved his pallet to the south wall so that Martha could have the full space near the hearth. He did this without being asked and without commenting on it. He lay against the south wall in the coldest part of the room and slept in his coat and said nothing about it in the morning. Martha did not sleep that night. She sat beside Eliza and gave her water when she would take it, and replaced the cloth on her forehead when it warmed, and listened to her breathe. The breathing was her primary instrument. As long as the breathing was clear and even, and not pulling, as long as there was no tightness in the chest that showed in the sound or in the way the small body worked to draw air. The fever was a fever, and not yet something worse. She listened. The breathing was clear. She listened to it anyway. All night, she sat in the orange light of the hearth with her hands in her lap and listened to her daughter breathe, and fed the fire when it needed feeding, and changed the cloth, and gave the water, and did everything that could be done, and then sat with the part that could not be done, the part that was just waiting and listening in the dark. Samuel came down from the loft at 2 in the morning. He came down quietly, without waking Eliza or Ruth, and stood for a moment at the base of the ladder, looking at his mother, sitting beside his sister. He said nothing. He went to the woodpile by the hearth and put 2 pieces on the fire. The right pieces. A maple and an oak. The way he had learned to do it over months of watching and doing. Then he went back up to the loft. Martha watched him do this. She said nothing. He had not done it for the acknowledgement. He had done it because it was the thing that could be done at 2 in the morning, and he could do it, and so he had. On the morning of the 4th day, the fever broke. Not all at once. It came down over the course of the morning in small increments. The skin less hot under Martha's hand at 7 than it had been at 5. Less hot at 9 than at 7. By noon, the particular quality of the 2 bright eyes had changed. had come down from that unsustainable brightness to something more ordinary and more present. Eliza looked at her mother and said, "I am hungry." Martha said, "I know. Hold on." She made porridge, thicker than the usual morning porridge, with a larger portion of cornmeal and some of the dried apples stirred in. This was a Tuesday. It was not one of the twice-a-week days. Eliza ate it slowly and finished it, and lay back and looked at the ceiling of the cabin. She said, "The ceiling has a crack in it I never noticed before." Martha looked up. There was a crack, a thin line in the wood above the sleeping loft, where two boards had dried and pulled slightly apart. It had been there since October. She said, "It has been there." Eliza said, "I never saw it before." Martha said, "You were not looking up before." Eliza was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Is the fire all right?" Martha looked at the hearth. The fire was doing what it did on a good day, burning steady on dry oak. The flames, the right height, the coals building up properly beneath them. She said, "The fire is fine." Eliza said, "I could hear it from when I was sick. I could hear when it was right and when it was getting low. Even when I was asleep, I could hear it." Martha looked at her. Eliza said, "It sounds different when it is getting low. It gets quieter, in a way that is different from regular quiet. It pulls back." Martha thought about this child, 7 years old, who had been listening to this cabin for 3 months, with the attentiveness of someone who had nothing else to do but be inside it and pay attention, who had learned to read it the way other children learn to read words on a page, by exposure and repetition and the particular kind of intelligence that lives in the body before it lives in the mind. She said, "Yes, you are right. It does." Eliza said, "I thought so." She closed her eyes and slept again. The real sleep this time. The deep, untroubled sleep of a body that had done hard work and was now recovering. The breathing even and slow and quiet. Martha sat beside her for a few more minutes. Then she got up and went to the hearth and added one piece of oak, a medium piece, the kind that would hold through the afternoon without needing attention. She stood at the hearth for a moment with her hand out toward the heat, feeling it on her palm. The fever was down. Eliza was sleeping. Ruth was building something out of small pieces of bark that Samuel had carved for her. Samuel was outside doing the afternoon water. Elias was at the woodpile, the sound of the splitting carrying through the walls in its familiar rhythm. The cabin was doing what the cabin did. She took her hand away from the heat. She started supper. January had been cold. February was cold and long and gray, and the same. This was the thing that January had not been the same. January had been new cold, deeper cold, the cold of a winter still building toward whatever it intended to be. And in its way, January had been interesting in the way that suffering is interesting when it is still new enough to observe. By February, the suffering was not new, and it was not interesting. It was simply the air in the room, and the weight of the blankets, and the color of the light through the oiled paper window every morning, and the taste of the food and the length of the day. The light in February was the worst part. The dark of December and January had at least the drama of its own depth. The long, solid black that descended at 4 in the afternoon and held until 7 the next morning. February light was the halfway light, the light of a season that had been going too long and had lost its conviction. Gray in the morning, grayer by noon, the flat pewter sky that had been sitting on the territory since November, still sitting there, neither lifting nor descending, just present, like a guest who had stayed past the point where anyone knew how to ask them to leave. Martha had made her calculations for February in October, the way she made all her calculations, in advance and in private. She had known that February would be harder than January, and she had prepared for that. She had stretched the salt pork and the beans and the cornmeal in January with the specific intention of giving February as much room as she could create for it. February arrived and took the room she had made and wanted more. The flour was the problem now. She had watched the barrel through October and November and December and January, watching it go down one measure at a time, and she had made the adjustments she could make. Smaller biscuits, less flour in the porridge. The days when cornmeal stood in for flour, entirely because cornmeal was further from empty than flour was. But February was the month where the margin between the adjustments she had made and the adjustments she still needed to make narrowed to something she could no longer manage, without everyone in the cabin understanding that it was being managed. Elias understood first. He came in from the woodpile one afternoon in the second week of February and looked at what Martha put down for supper. He said nothing. He ate everything in his bowl, and then looked at the pot, and looked at Martha, and looked back at the table. He said, "I am going to cut the morning portions back." Martha looked at him. He said, "I am doing as much work outside as I was in December, and I do not need to eat like it. I can do on less in the mornings." She said, "You cannot." He said, "I can." She said, "Elias." He said, "Martha, I can do on less. Let me do on less." She looked at him for a long time. Then she said, "The children stay the same." He said, "Of course." She said, "All right." She adjusted his portions from that morning. She did not adjust hers further than she already had because there was not enough further to go without consequences she was not willing to accept. Consequences that would show up first in her ability to do the work the cabin required of her. She ate what she needed to eat to do what she needed to do. She did not eat more. February in the cabin was quieter than January had been. The conversations that had accompanied meals in November and December, the talk about the animals and the wood and the plans for spring, had thinned out the way the portions had thinned out. Slowly and without announcement, one day at supper, Martha realized that the four of them had eaten an entire meal with fewer than 20 exchanges of words, and nobody had seemed to notice. It was not tension. It was not unhappiness. It was the particular silence of people who had been in a small room together for 4 months and had said most of what they had to say and had arrived at the deeper level of being together, which required less language than the surface level and was, in its way, more honest. Elias sat by the fire in the evenings and worked at whatever small repair the cabin or the barn required, and he was quiet. Martha sat by the fire and mended and was quiet. The children were less quiet, being children, but even they had settled into the slower rhythm of February. Ruth had taken to long afternoon naps that she had not needed since she was 2. Her small body making demands on her energy that the food available could not entirely meet. Martha watched this and gave Ruth the best of what was available each day, and watched her color and her weight and her sleep, and said nothing to anyone about what she was watching. Samuel was the one who showed February most clearly. He showed it in his marks. On a Thursday afternoon, in the second week of the month, he stood before the beam and ran his thumb from the bottom mark to where he was, and then from where he was to the top mark. And he stood there for a long time with his thumb resting on the wood. He had moved the top mark twice. He had moved it because the winter proved longer than he had calculated, because the thaw did not come when he had first predicted, and did not come when he had revised his prediction, and still had not come. He had moved the mark with reluctance both times, and with the private acknowledgement that his original estimate had been wrong, and his revised estimate might also be wrong. He moved it a third time. He pressed the knife into the wood above where the top mark had been, and made a new mark, higher on the beam than any previous mark, higher than he had originally believed winter could reasonably extend. And he put the knife away and stood back and looked at the distance between where he was and where he had moved the end of winter to. He had been certain in October that he could see the shape of the winter. He had looked at the sky and the woodpile and the bent birches and the flat white light of late October, and he had calculated, and his calculation had felt solid and well-reasoned and built on what he knew. What he had not known in October was how much he did not know about winter. He did not say any of this to anyone. He went out to the barn and broke the ice on the trough, and forked hay from the loft, and talked to Belle in the quiet, reasonable way he talked to her. He told her that March was coming, that the grass would come back, that she would not always be standing in a cold barn eating hay. He did not know if this was true exactly in the form he stated it. He knew it was true in the general direction. Belle stood and ate and looked at him. He went back inside. At supper that night, Eliza said, "How much longer do you think?" She said it the way questions come out when they have been living inside a person for some time and have finally found their moment. Nobody answered for a moment. Then Ruth said, from her place beside Martha, with the complete authority of a 3-year-old who had not been asked long, she said it directly and without qualification. Then she went back to her food. Samuel looked at his bowl. Elias looked at the fire. Martha said nothing. The fire burned in the hearth, the same fire that had been burning since October, rebuilt every morning from the coals of the night before, never allowed to go fully out. The continuous fire that was the heartbeat of the cabin, and the reason everyone in it was still alive and warm enough to be tired of February. Long? Yes, that was February. The keg went first. It was an empty salt barrel, small, the one that had held the winter's pork, and had been empty since the 3rd week of January, when Martha had scraped the last of the salt from the bottom and used it on the remaining meat. The barrel had been sitting in the corner near the door since then, taking up space that nothing else was using. And on a morning in the 1st week of February, when Elias came in from the barn and stood at the hearth and looked at the woodpile beside it, and looked at the barrel and looked back at the woodpile, the calculation was simple enough that neither of them needed to say it out loud. He took the barrel apart with the small hatchet, working the staves loose from the iron hoops and stacking them beside the hearth. Salt-cured wood. It burned hot and fast, the way thin, dry wood always burned, giving up its heat quickly and completely. It bought them 2 days. Martha noted this without comment. After the barrel came the second shelf. The cabin had 2 shelves on the east wall, rough-cut boards set into notches Elias had cut in the logs. The upper shelf held the medicine box and the candle tin and the few small things that needed to be off the floor and accessible. The lower shelf had held the extra crockery through fall and early winter. But the extra crockery was now the regular crockery, because 3 of the original pieces had broken, and the shelf itself held nothing but the marks of where things had sat. Elias took the lower shelf down on a Tuesday. He did it in the morning, while the children were at their tasks, not to avoid them seeing it, but because Tuesday morning was when it made sense, and he was not a man who delayed practical work for symbolic reasons. He worked the boards free from their notches and laid them on the floor. Samuel came in with the water and stopped and looked at the empty notches in the wall where the shelf had been. He said, "The shelf." Elias said, "We do not need it." Samuel looked at the boards on the floor and looked at the woodpile and understood the arithmetic. He set the water buckets on the upper shelf, which was now the only shelf, and went back outside. The boards burned well. Dry pine caught fast and threw good heat, and the flames had a brightness to them that the oak and maple did not. Something in the resin. And Eliza sat near the hearth that evening and watched the fire. She said it burns a different color. Martha said, "Pine does that?" Eliza said, "Is it still good heat?" Martha said, "Good enough." It bought them 3 days. This was the rhythm of it. A thing that was not wood became wood, and wood became heat, and heat was counted in days, and days were the unit of everything. Martha ran the count continuously, adjusting as each new source came in and each new day went out, and the count remained where it had been for the past 2 weeks, which was close enough to not enough that she thought about it every time she opened the cabin door and looked at the woodpile stacked against the south wall. The woodpile had been going down since November. What was not expected, or not fully expected, was the rate. Michigan Territory, in the winter of 1836, was delivering cold at a consistency that Elias, in his September calculations, had not fully accounted for. He had planned for cold. He had planned for deep cold. He had not planned for deep cold every night without the breaks that the previous 2 winters had provided. The warming spells that lasted 3 or 4 days and gave the woodpile a chance to coast. There were no coasting days. The cold came down each night with the same weight it had brought in January, and the fire had to answer it every night with the same fire it had burned in January, and the woodpile went down accordingly. Elias went out every morning and looked at it, and came in and said nothing. And Martha watched him come in and read what his silence said. She had known this moment was coming. She had been managing toward it since November, creating the margins where she could create them, using things in the order that minimized the damage, stretching the interval between the moment when a thing ran low and the moment when it ran out. She had been good at this. She was still being good at it. The problem was that being good at it could slow the approach of the moment but could not stop it. And the moment was here. She began her own inventory of the cabin. She walked the rooms slowly. Not the food inventory she ran every day, but the inventory of objects, of the things that occupied space and had mass and were made of wood and could, if the calculation required it, become something other than what they were. The stool beside the hearth, 3-legged, used for sitting when cooking and for reaching the upper shelf and for setting wet boots on near the fire to dry. She looked at it and moved on. still learning its place. The wooden box that held the children's extra clothing, a simple pine box with a fitted lid. Sitting at the foot of the loft ladder, she opened it and looked inside. 2 shirts, 1 pair of Samuel's trousers he had outgrown in December, Ruth's spare dress, Eliza's extra stockings. The box was still holding something necessary. The length of pine board leaning against the north wall that Elias had cut in October as a potential replacement for a roof board he thought might need replacing. Had not replaced. Had kept because it was cut and dry and might still be needed. She looked at it for a long time. She left it where it was. She was not making decisions today. She was making the list. Decisions came after the list, when she could see the whole of it and choose in the right order. She turned and looked at the corner by the door. The chair was there, the maple chair with the straight back and the worn seat that her father had made in Ohio the winter before her wedding. It sat in the corner the way it had sat since October, in the only place it did not cost her anything essential. At the edge of the firelight, where the floor stayed coldest and the shadows were deepest. She looked at it. She did not look at it the way she had looked at the salt barrel or the shelf. She looked at it with the part of her that was not the part that ran calculations. The part that ran underneath the calculations, quieter and slower and harder to manage. She looked away. She went back to the hearth and started the afternoon's work. That evening, Elias came in late from the barn and stood at the hearth longer than he needed to. He was warming his hands, but he was also thinking, and Martha knew the difference between a man warming his hands and a man thinking while he warmed his hands. He said, without looking at her, "I found 2 pieces of the old fence rail at the back of the barn. The section I took down in September to reset the posts. I forgot about them." She said, "How long?" He said, 6 feet each. "Drei." She said, "That is something." He said, 2 or 3 days if we are careful." She said, "Then we are careful." He sat down. The fence rail sections went in over 3 days, cut into lengths that fit the hearth, burning with the reliable heat of dry wood that had been weathering since before last winter. It was not a solution. It was an extension. And extensions were what this part of winter ran on. Samuel made his weekly mark on the beam on Thursday. He stood at the beam and pressed the notch in and ran his thumb from the bottom to where he was, and then upward toward the top mark. The March mark he had moved 3 times. He stood there longer than usual. Then he turned and looked at the cabin. He looked at it the way he had not looked at it since October. The way you look at a thing when you are assessing it rather than living inside it. He looked at the woodpile beside the hearth, lower than it had been on any previous Thursday. He looked at the empty notches on the east wall where the second shelf had been. He looked at the corner where the salt barrel had sat and now no longer sat. He looked at the corner by the door. The chair was there. He had not thought about the chair before. It had been part of the room since October, as permanent seeming as the walls or the hearth, one of the fixed things. But he was looking at the room differently now, the way you look at a room when you have been watching a woodpile go down for 3 months and have started seeing everything in terms of what it could become. He looked at the chair. He looked at his mother at the hearth. She was not looking at him. She was looking at the pot. He put the knife away and went to get the afternoon water. He did not say anything about the chair. Nobody said anything about the chair. But that evening at supper, When Elias reached for the salt and his eyes crossed the corner by the door on the way back, his eyes stopped there for a moment. Just a moment. Then he looked at his bowl and continued eating. Martha was looking at her bowl. She had seen it. She put a piece of salt pork in her mouth and chewed it and swallowed it and looked at the fire. The fire was burning well on the last of the fence rail and one piece of oak, a good, controlled burn. The coals building up properly underneath. The room was warm. The children were eating. Ruth was telling Eliza something about what she had seen the hogs doing that afternoon. A story that required several retellings because Ruth's sense of narrative at 3 years old was more circular than linear. The cabin was holding, for this evening, on the last of the fence rail and one piece of oak. The cabin was holding, and the family was fed and warm and present, and the fire was good. Martha looked at the corner by the door. The chair was still there. She looked at it for a long moment. Then she looked away and listened to Ruth explain the hogs for the third time and let the warmth of the fire work against the cold. The walls were letting in and did not say anything about the chair. Not tonight. But she had looked at it, and now she knew that the looking had started, and that the looking, once it started, did not stop until the question it was asking had been answered. The night it happened was not the coldest night of the winter. That was the thing Martha would remember afterward. That it was not the extraordinary night she might have expected it to be. Not the night of the worst storm or the deepest cold. It was a Wednesday in the 3rd week of February. Ordinary. In every way, that February was ordinary. The temperature was low, in the range it had been for weeks. And the wind was from the northwest. And the sky was what the February sky always was. Flat and gray and without opinion. What made it the night was the woodpile. Elias had looked at it that morning and said nothing. And Martha had looked at it that afternoon and said nothing. And they had gone through the day knowing what the other knew and not yet saying it, because saying it before supper meant sitting with it through supper. And supper was a meal she was trying to keep ordinary for the children. After supper, after Ruth was asleep on her pallet, and Eliza was in the loft, and Samuel was at the beam making his mark, Elias went to the woodpile and looked at it in the firelight. He counted what was there. He came back to the hearth and stood beside Martha. He said, quietly enough that Samuel could not hear 3 days, maybe 4 if I cut back the night fires. Martha said, you cannot cut back the night fires. The temperature is not going to lift before the weekend. He said, I know. She said, 3 days. He said, yes. She said, I will go through the barn tomorrow and see what is stored there. There may be usable wood in the old stall divider. He said, I already looked. Green pine. Cut last fall. It will burn, but it will smoke, and it will not give good heat. She said, then we burn it for smoke and save the dry wood for nights. He said, yes. That buys us another day. Maybe 2, she said, and after that, he looked at the fire. She looked at the fire. She said, I have been through the room. He said, I know. She said, there is the pine board on the north wall. He said, yes. She said, the children's clothing box. But the box is still holding things we need. He said, yes. She said, and the chair. She said it the way she said all necessary things, directly and without preamble. The way she said, the flour barrel is below halfway, and the fever has gone up, and the door will not open. A fact stated in the manner of a woman who had made her private accounting and was now making it shared. Elias was quiet. The fire burned. Outside, the wind moved at the northwest corner in its familiar way. The low, patient pressure it had been applying to that corner since November. Samuel had stopped making his mark and was sitting at the base of the loft ladder pulling off his boots. And the sounds he made doing this, the ordinary sounds of the end of a day, were the only other sounds in the room. Elias said the pine board and the clothing box first. "That is 2 more days." She said yes. He said, "And then we see where we are." She said yes. He went to bed. Martha sat by the fire. She sat for a long time after the cabin had gone to sleep, doing the quiet accounting of the day and the projection of what came next. She heard Elias's breathing slow into sleep. She heard the children settle. She heard Ruth make a small sound and be still. She looked at the corner by the door. The chair was there in the firelight. She looked at it the way she had not let herself look at it before, fully, without immediately looking away. The maple frame, still the color of good wood after all these years, lighter than the cabin logs around it, a different kind of tree from the oak and pine that made up the walls. The worn seat, the wear, that was her own body's history on it. The particular compression of the weave that showed where she had sat through years of Ohio evenings while her father sat across from her and the fire went in the hearth. Her father had made it the winter before her wedding, working in the cold of his workshop with the patience of a man who built things to last. He had not rushed it. She knew this because she had seen him work, and she had seen the chair. And the chair was not a rushed thing. The joints were cut with care. The back rails were shaped to the curve of a sitting spine. The legs were set at an angle that gave it a stability that cheaper chairs did not have, that made it sit solid on a floor the way a patient person sits, without fidgeting. He had wrapped it in canvas on the morning she left his house. He had said only something that holds you. He had been dead for 6 years. She sat at the hearth and looked at the chair her father had made, and she thought about Ohio and the workshop and the morning she left his house. She thought about him working by lamplight in January, while the snow came down outside his window, fitting the joints, checking the angles, building into the chair the things he knew about sitting and staying, and endurance that he could not have put into words, but could put into wood. She sat with all of this for a while, then she put it down. She put it down the way she put other necessary things down, when the putting down was what the situation required, with the deliberateness of a woman who knew the difference between a feeling that needed to be lived in for a while and a feeling that needed to be finished so that the practical world could resume. She put it down. She went to bed. In the morning she burned the pine roof board and the clothing box. The children's spare things folded and stacked along the south wall, and the 2 pieces of dry wood saved for the night. The day was warm enough, and the night was survivable. The next morning was Thursday. Elias looked at the woodpile. He came inside and stood at the hearth. He said, "Tomorrow." She said yes. She did not say what tomorrow meant. He knew what tomorrow meant. He went to the barn. Thursday passed. Friday morning. Martha was up before the others. She fed the fire with the last of the dry wood, building the hearth up to a heat that would hold through the morning. Then she sat on the floor near the hearth in the early light and waited for the family to wake. Elias was first. He sat up and looked at the fire, and looked at the woodpile, and looked at Martha. She said, "Today." He nodded. She said, "I want to do it this morning, before the fire comes down." He said, "All right." He got up and dressed. The children were awake by then, coming down from the loft and appearing from the pallets with the rumpled, wondering look of children pulled out of sleep before they were finished with it. Martha gave them breakfast, the morning cornmeal, and they ate and sat near the fire. Martha stood up from the hearth. She crossed the room to the corner by the door. She sat down in the chair. She sat in it the way she had sat in it thousands of times in Ohio, with her back straight and her hands in her lap, and she felt the familiar shape of it under her, the worn seat and the solid legs and the slight backward lean of the back rails that her father had built in, because he had known how a person needed to sit at the end of a day. She felt all of it at once, the whole of what the chair was, and she sat in it for as long as it took to feel that completely. Nobody spoke. Eliza watched her from across the room with the full attention she brought to things she understood were important. Samuel watched with his hands very still at his sides. Ruth looked at the chair with the open curiosity of a child who did not yet know what she was watching but understood from the quality of the room's silence that it was something. Elias stood by the hearth. Martha sat in the chair. She sat in it for perhaps 2 minutes. Then she stood up. She looked at Elias. He came to the chair. He did not pick it up whole. He looked at it for a moment, the way he looked at things he was about to take apart, reading the joints, understanding the order, and then he knelt and began to work the legs loose from the seat with his hands and the small hatchet, carefully, not forcing anything. The joints were good. They had been good for years, and they were good now. The wood fitted with the precision of a man who had known what he was building and had built it to last. It did not come apart easily. He worked at it steadily and without rushing, and the chair came apart piece by piece. The legs first, and then the back rails, and then the seat. Each piece laid on the floor beside the hearth in the order it came free. Samuel watched. Eliza watched. Ruth watched from beside Eliza with her hand on her sister's arm. Martha stood at the hearth with her back to the room and her face toward the fire. She did not watch. She listened to the sound of the hatchet working the joints, the small, careful sounds of something being taken apart that had been built to stay together. And she let those sounds be what they were. Something that holds you. Yes, still. Elias fed the first pieces to the fire. The back legs went in first, then the front legs, then the back rails one by one. He did not put everything in at once. He fed them in the order the fire needed them, giving the hearth time to take each piece fully before adding the next, managing the burn the way he managed all fires, with attention to what the fire needed rather than what was convenient. Maple burned differently from oak, slower than pine, hotter than most things, with a clean smell, the smell of good wood giving itself to the heat completely. The chair burned for 2 hours. That was longer than most wood. Martha's father had built it well. Samuel stood at the base of the loft ladder and looked at the fire for a long time. He looked at it with his full attention and thought about the chair sitting in the corner since October. And he thought about his marks on the beam and the long winter they measured. And he thought about his mother sitting in the chair for 2 minutes before it was taken apart. He thought about what it had taken to build something well enough that it lasted long enough to be worth something at the end. Eliza sat near the hearth and felt the heat of the maple fire on her face. She said, quietly, to no one in particular, "It is warmer." She had not been told that maple burned hot. She had worked it out over months of sitting near the hearth and paying attention to what the fire said in the different voices of different woods. And she had arrived at it the same way she had arrived at everything she knew about the cabin, through the accumulated intelligence of a body that had been paying attention since October. Martha turned from the hearth. The chair was gone. The corner by the door was empty. Just the packed earth floor and the shadow. The space that had held the chair since October, now holding nothing except the cold that always gathered near the door. She looked at the empty corner for a moment. Then she looked at the fire. The maple was burning well. The flames, a slightly different quality than oak flames, a touch brighter and more even. And the heat coming off the hearth was the good solid heat of wood that had been built by someone who understood wood, cut and shaped and joined by hands that knew what they were doing. The cabin was warm. The family was inside it. The fire was burning. That was enough. That was all it needed to be. Martha heard it before. She understood what it was. She was at the hearth on a Tuesday morning in the first week of March, doing the same thing she did every Tuesday morning, which was the same thing she did every morning, building the fire up from the overnight coals and setting the water on and measuring out the cornmeal for breakfast. Her hands knew where everything was without her eyes needing to direct them. Her body moving through the morning routine, the way a river moves through a familiar channel, by the shape of things rather than by decision. She heard a sound. She stopped. She stood at the hearth with the cornmeal scoop in her hand and listened. It was coming from above. From the roof, a small, irregular sound, softer than tapping, softer and more patient. A sound that came and stopped and came again in no particular rhythm. The rhythm of something that was not trying to make a rhythm, just doing what it did when the conditions permitted. Water, dripping. She set the cornmeal scoop down on the shelf. She did not call for anyone. She went to the door and lifted the bar and opened it, and stood in the doorway with the cold coming in around her and looked at the eave. The snow on the roof was still white and deep, still the full weight of a winter's accumulation sitting on the boards above her. Nothing had changed that she could see. But at the very edge of the eave, where the roof overhung the doorway, a line of small drops was forming and falling, one at a time, each one gathering at the tip of a piece of ice and swelling until it was heavy enough, and then letting go. Drop, pause, drop, pause. She stood in the doorway and watched this for a long time. The air on her face was cold, still genuinely cold. The cold of early March in Michigan territory. The cold that had business here and was not yet finished with that business. But it was different cold than February cold. She could not have explained the difference in terms anyone could measure. She felt it as a quality rather than a temperature. A slight giving in the air. A reduction in the weight of it. As though winter had been pressing down from above for months and had lifted just slightly, just enough to notice. She went back inside. She did not say anything to anyone. She finished the cornmeal and woke the children, and sat the family at breakfast, and served the morning meal, and listened. Under the sound of Ruth talking and Samuel pulling on his boots and Elias moving to the woodpile, to the sound of the water dripping from the eave. Drop, pausa, drop. Eliza heard it first. Of the others. She stopped eating and tilted her head in the way she tilted it when she was listening for something specific. The particular stillness of a child whose primary instrument was her ears, and who had learned to trust that instrument over 4 months of trusting nothing else as completely. She said, "What is that sound?" Samuel said, "What sound?" She said, "From the roof." "Listen." Samuel listened. His face changed. He said, "Is that water?" Martha said, "Eat your breakfast." He ate his breakfast, but he looked at the ceiling while he ate. And when he was done, he looked at his mother. She said, "Finish your water and go to the barn." He went to the barn. But before he went out the door, he stopped on the step and looked up at the eave and stood there for a moment. And Martha watched him stand there, watched his face in the morning light, watched him hear it. Drop, pausa, drop. He went to the barn. The dripping stopped by mid-morning when the temperature dropped back to where it had been. The brief warming that had produced it closed back down, and the eave went dry and the sound went away. But it had been there. Martha thought about this through the morning, the way she thought about everything that affected the calculations. Because the first drip from an eave in March was not proof of anything. It was 1 warm hour in a month that still had 3 weeks left in it. And 3 weeks in Michigan territory in March could contain anything. She had talked to Morse's wife in October, who had been here 5 years. And Ruth Morse had said, "The worst storm we ever had came the 2nd week of March, and we had already started believing it was over." Martha did not start believing it was over. She started holding the possibility that it might, at some point, be over. That was different. That night she told Elias what she had heard. She told him after the children were in the loft. In the quiet way, she told him the things she was uncertain about, without confidence or reassurance, but as a plain account of what she had observed. She said the eave was dripping this morning. For about 2 hours. He was quiet for a moment. He said, "I know. I heard it from the barn." She said, "It stopped when the temperature came back down." He said, "Yes." She said, "It is not over." He said, "No." She said, "But it happened." He looked at the fire. Then he looked at her. He said, "Yes, it happened." They sat with this for a while. 2 people who had been sitting in this room together since October and had learned the particular economy of saying exactly what was necessary and no more, who had arrived by necessity at a language stripped of anything that was not load-bearing. The fire burned between them. Outside, the night was cold, and the sky was clear for the first time in days, and the stars were out with the particular brightness that came when the clouds were gone and the air was dry. A brightness that had its own cold in it. The cold of exposed sky in early March that reminded you the season was not yet done. But the eve had dripped. In the morning the temperature had dropped back hard, and the yard was white, and the path to the barn had a fresh inch of snow on it from a light overnight fall. And the cold on Elias's face when he opened the door was the same cold it had been since November. He went to the barn. He broke the ice on the trough and forked down the hay and checked Belle's shoulder, which had healed completely over the past 6 weeks to a smooth patch of short new hair over the place the sore had been. And he stood in the barn and looked at his animals and looked at the barn walls, and thought about the winter. He had come into this winter as a man who believed that work was sufficient, that if he cut enough wood and built enough chinking and dug enough paths and rose early enough and stayed up late enough, the winter would not be able to find what it was looking for in his cabin. He had believed this honestly, and had worked from this belief honestly, and the work had been real, and the belief had not been wrong. Exactly. But it had been incomplete. The winter had found things anyway. It had found the cracks he could not seal, and the food he could not stretch far enough, and the cold he could not fully exclude, and the objects he had not planned to burn, and the chair that was not there anymore. It had found the limits of what he knew. He stood in the barn in the early March cold and thought about Thomas, whom Caleb Morse had described, who had looked at the squirrel caches in September and known something that Elias had not known how to look for. He thought about the trail between his cabin and Morse's, the old depression in the ground that his feet followed without his mind directing them. He thought about 2 winters from now, 3 winters from now, the winters he had not yet lived through this land, and what they would teach him that this one had not had time to teach. He had believed in October that good work held. He understood now that good work was a beginning, not a conclusion. The northwest corner had cracked 3 times. The cracks would keep coming. He would keep repacking them. That was not failure, and it was not success. It was just the nature of the thing you built as well as you could, and then you watched what the seasons asked of what you had built, and you answered accordingly. The winter had not humbled him the way a defeat humbles a man. It had informed him the way a long lesson informs a person who was paying attention, slowly and without ceremony, about the distance between what he had known in October and what there was still to know. Belle looked at him. He put his hand on her neck. He said, quietly, "To Belle, or to no one, we made it this far." He went back to the cabin. 2 days later, the temperature rose. Not dramatically. It rose the way March temperatures rose in Michigan territory. Incrementally, grudgingly, as though the cold was not yet convinced it was done but had agreed to negotiate, from what it had been to something 10 degrees less than what it had been, and then 2 days after that to something 10 degrees less than that. The eve dripped for 6 hours on the first warm day. Samuel stood under it in the afternoon and held his hand out and let the drops hit his palm one at a time. They were cold. They were not quite freezing. They were water in a way that the snow and the ice had not been water, the form it had been in for months. Locked and still, these drops moved. They came off the eave with intention and fell with intention, and hit his palm and ran between his fingers. He stood there for a while. He went inside and climbed to the beam and looked at his marks. The bottom mark, October, small and slightly uncertain. The first notch he had pressed into the wood on the morning he decided to count. The marks climbing from there, week by week, through November and December and January and February. Each one pressed in with the knife his father had given him. The top mark, March, moved 3 times from where he had first put it in October. Each move an acknowledgement that he had not known what he was predicting, that the winter was longer and harder and less subject to prediction than a 12-year-old in October could fully understand. He put his thumb on the top mark. He thought about the eve dripping. He thought about Belle eating her full portion on Christmas morning. He thought about the door that would not open and the shelf that was not there anymore, and the sound of his father's hatchet taking the chair apart joint by joint. He thought about his mother sitting in the chair for 2 minutes before it was gone, and the way the room had been silent while she did it. The particular silence of a family understanding something together without anyone having to say it. He thought about his mother at the hearth at 4 in the morning, adding wood to a fire that had gone low, doing it in the dark with no candle and no ceremony, because it needed to be done, and she was the one awake to do it. He had made these marks to measure the winter, to hold it at a distance where he could see it whole, to know when it would end. He had been wrong about when it would end. He had been wrong 3 times. But the marks were right about something he had not known he was measuring when he started. Something about what a family could hold together inside a room that was too small and too cold with food that was not quite enough. Doing the work that needed doing each day without knowing for certain that doing it would be sufficient. He did not have the full words for it yet. He was 12 years old, and some things came to language later than they came to the body. He took his thumb off the mark. He climbed down from the loft. He went outside. The yard was still white. The path to the barn was still packed hard, but the sky was different. The flat pewter sky that had been sitting on Michigan territory since November had blue working into it at the edges. The blue of a sky that was thinking about being something other than winter sky. Samuel stood in the yard and looked at the sky. He heard the eave dripping behind him. He heard, from somewhere in the trees at the edge of the clearing, a sound he had not heard since October. A bird, one bird, making a sound that was brief and tentative, as though the bird itself was not entirely certain it was time and was testing the air with a few notes before committing to anything. Samuel stood very still. The bird made its sound again. Then it was quiet. He went back inside. He said, at the door, to no one in particular, and to all of them at once, "There is a bird out there." Ruth looked up from the floor where she had been playing. Eliza said, "What kind?" He said, "I do not know." Small. It made 3 sounds and stopped. Eliza said, "Maybe it is testing." He said, "Maybe." Ruth said, "Bird." She said it the way she said the things she filed, directly and finally, as though the word itself was the conclusion of a long consideration. Martha did not turn from the hearth, but she was listening. She had been listening since Tuesday when she first heard the eave dripping, and she was still listening now, on this afternoon, when the sky had blue working into its edges, and a bird had made 3 sounds in the clearing, and her son had come in to tell the family about it. She was listening the way she had listened all winter, carefully and without certainty, and with the full understanding that listening was not the same as knowing, and that knowing was not the same as safe. But the bird had been there. She stirred the pot. The fire burned. Outside, the eave continued its slow work, drop by drop, and then stream by stream, the winter making its way off the roof in the form it had always been underneath, which was water, which was what everything became again in March, if you waited long enough, and the fire held, and the walls held, and the family held. The water came down. Look at the cabin in April. The chinking on the north wall had been repacked so many times through the winter that it was a different color from the original work, layered in shades of gray and brown that marked each session. The oldest clay darkest and deepest, and the newest work still pale. The whole record of a wall that had been argued with continuously for 5 months. The floor near the door was worn in a new pattern. The packed earth had been compressed by the winter's traffic into a shallow depression, along the path from the door to the hearth, and a harder flat place beside the hearth itself, where someone stood every morning while the fire was built. The same person, the same position, day after day, until the ground remembered it. The east wall had 2 notches where the shelf had been, and nothing else. The empty notches dark and clean in the wood. The beam above the loft ladder held 147 marks. Samuel counted them on a morning in the 2nd week of April, when the snow was gone from everything but the deepest shadows in the north-facing hollows under the trees. When the mud had come and gone, and the ground was beginning to firm under the first warmth of real spring, he counted them once, carefully, his thumb touching each notch in turn, from the first uncertain mark of October to the last firm mark of March. 147. He stood with the number for a moment. He had made these marks to measure the winter, to hold the distance between beginning and end where he could see it. He had moved the ending mark 3 times. He had been wrong about when winter ended, and wrong again, and wrong a 3rd time. And then in March, the bird had made its sound in the clearing, and the eve had dripped for 6 hours straight, and the temperature had risen and not come back down the way it had come back down all the other times. And the winter had ended. The marks had measured something else besides the winter. He was not sure yet what to call it. He was 12 years old, and the language for some things came later than the things themselves. But he knew it was not only the winter he had measured. It was what the winter had made of all of them. The marks that something hard and long and unrelenting leaves in a person, the way it leaves marks in packed earth, in the shape of the path you walked every day until the ground held it. He took his thumb away from the beam. He went outside. Elias was in the south field with Belle, working the soil with the hand plow, turning the winter's accumulation into the surface that spring planting required. He worked steadily, and Belle moved with him in the patient way she had always moved, through any task she was given, with the same quality of attention she had brought to standing in a cold barn all winter and eating her hay and giving her milk and surviving. Samuel went to help his father. Elias heard him coming through the yard and did not stop the plow, but shifted his grip on the handles and nodded once at the near side of the plow line, the place where a second pair of hands was useful. And Samuel took up that position without being told and put his weight into it, and the 2 of them worked the ground together in the back and forth of plowing, Belle moving between them, all 3 working the same piece of earth toward the same spring. Inside the cabin, Martha was at the hearth. The iron pot was on the crane above the fire, the way it had been on the crane above the fire every day since October, swinging over the same heat in the same motion. The fire this morning was smaller than the winter fires had been, a cooking fire rather than a survival fire, the difference being that a cooking fire was built to a purpose, and a survival fire was built to a threshold and kept there regardless of anything else. She stirred the pot. She listened to the sounds of the cabin in April. The fire, quieter than winter fire, speaking in the smaller voice of a fire that was not being asked to do everything at once. The wind outside, different from winter wind, the warmth in it, making it a different kind of moving air. air with somewhere to go, rather than air pressing in from a fixed and frozen north. The sound of Samuel's boots crossing the yard toward the south field. The sound of Ruth somewhere behind the cabin. Outside, for the first time in months, in the real loose way of a child who had been kept inside too long, talking to something that may have been the hogs, or may have been no one. The monologue of a 3-year-old who had things to say and a yard to say them in. Eliza was at the door. She stood on the step with her face turned toward the clearing, listening. She did this every morning now. Stood on the step and listened to the yard, reading it the way she had learned to read the cabin through the winter, by sound and quality and what the sound said about the state of things. She said, "Without turning, the bird is back." Martha said, "Which one?" "Eliza," said the small one. "The one Samuel heard in March." "I think it is the same one." Martha said, "It probably is. Birds come back to places they found worth coming back to." Eliza stood on the step and listened to the bird across the clearing, certain of itself now, in a way it had not been in March, when it had made 3 tentative sounds and stopped. This was the same bird returned to a place it had left, and found still standing and decided was worth the summer. She went back inside. She stood in the middle of the room and looked at it. The same walls, same hearth, same loft, above the same ladder, same door with the same leather hinges that Elias had never replaced and that had held all winter anyway. But it was not the same room. It had the smell of winter in it, the deep-set smell of months of smoke and cold and living that worked into wood the way weather worked into wood. Not as a stain, but as a change in the material itself. Eliza stood in the middle of it. She thought this room knows something now that it did not know in October. Then she went to the hearth and stood beside her mother and listened to the fire. It was not the winter fire. She could hear the difference without having to think about it, the way she could hear every difference. Now, after months of listening to this one room, the winter fire had sounded like something holding a door shut, steady and effortful and continuous. The sound of a thing doing the most important work it had ever been asked to do. This fire sounded like something making breakfast, smaller, easier, certain of its own sufficiency. She stood beside Martha and felt the warmth of it on her face. It was enough for this morning. It was the right kind of enough. Martha looked at the corner by the door. The chair was not there. The corner was empty. Just the packed earth floor and the shadow that gathered near the door in the morning, before the sun moved around to the south wall. She looked at it the way she had made herself look at it in the weeks since February, directly and without looking away, letting it be what it was. An empty corner in a cabin that was still standing, a family that was still alive, a fire that was still burning, different now, smaller and quieter and sufficient in the way of a fire that had earned the right to be less than everything. She thought about her father in his workshop in Ohio, working by lamplight, building a chair to hold his daughter for however long she needed holding. She thought about the fact that it had held her for 17 years, and then held her family through a Michigan winter, and then held the cold back for 2 hours on a February night when 2 hours was what was needed. He built it well. She stirred the pot. Outside, Belle moved through the south field with Elias and Samuel, all 3 working the ground together in the patient back and forth of a plow line, turning the winter under, bringing the living soil back to the surface where the spring could reach it. The fire burned. The bird made its sound across the clearing. Ruth's voice came from behind the cabin, talking to the hogs, or the air, or the April morning, the running commentary of a 3-year-old who had been inside too long and had things to say about everything she encountered now that the world had opened back up. The Whitakers had not conquered winter. They had not mastered the frontier. They had held a line inside 4 walls of imperfect wood for 147 days, one night at a time, until there were no more nights left to hold. That was the whole of it. That, it turned out, had been enough. The cabin stood in the April light. The field was being turned. The fire burned low and clean and sufficient. A spring fire now. A fire that knew what it was for, without being asked to be everything at once. The bird came back.